In this video, I'll discuss the history of money. Everyone understands the concept of money, but no one would blame you if you didn't stop and think about where it all started and why. Money, after all, is a tool that we use to buy and sell things. And in the earliest days, before there was money or currency systems, people bartered for things. If you had goats that I wanted and I had something you wanted, say some grain, we'd agree on a price, that is, how many goats for how much grain. It really depended on what our respective needs were and how much I was willing to give and how much you were willing to give. Around 15,000 BCE, during the Stone Age, obsidian, a glassy black volcanic rock, had value because it was used to make very strong tools. And around 9,000 BCE, obsidian had its own form of currency, in a sense, as trade of the stone began. Around the same time, cattle became a form of currency because societies were agrarian and cattle had great value for all sorts of reasons, for grazing, for giving milk, and for drawing plows, and so on. Around 4000 BCE, gold, which is valued for many reasons, such as its malleability, appearance, and density, was traded in bar form by the Egyptians, and around 1760 BCE, the Code of Hammurabi was formed. It's perhaps the best known of the ancient legal codes, and it had specific rules about money, debts, and fines. And civilians eventually developed economies based around some form of currency, for example, the Mesopotamians and Babylonians. The earliest currency came in various forms. Shells and other items were used because they looked nice, and while the shells themselves held no intrinsic value, they represented value. But the first example of money being used as a commodity is thought to be in China around 1000 BCE, and standardized currency, different coins formed from metal and given values, was established by the king of Lydia around 600 BCE. Metal, especially precious metals like silver and gold, quickly became the currency of choice because it was easy to subdivide and shape into coins that could be traded for goods and services, and it was easy to test the purity of the metal. The practice of using metal coins spread throughout the Mediterranean into Greece and Italy, and as a point of interest, the word money came from the word silver in many languages. Money throughout history came in many forms, as previously discussed, in metal, paper, and objects like shells, stones, and beads. And metals measured in a certain unit of measurement, namely weight, became the method for dividing money into subunits. For example, the British pound, which got its name because 1 British pound was linked to 1 pound of silver. As the use of money progressed, other forms, specifically paper, became a common way of trading money, and it was linked to currency. Examples include banknotes, bearer certificates, and demand deposits, which were used to represent money, which was held somewhere in a vault, if you will, because it was impractical to trade in large amounts of gold and silver. Because paper is light and easy to transport, paper money became common throughout Europe as a form of credit, and that's how money was traded for hundreds of years until the modern digital age, when everything changed because EFT, electronic funds transfer, became a form of currency in a sense that no physical currency changes hands. The first credit card was the Diners Club card in 1949, and plastic debit cards became a common way to transfer currency in the 1980s. Computers transfer massive amounts of money each day without it ever touching human hands, and suddenly mobile payments became the standard form of currency transfer or hard currency. Then, in 2008, at the outset of the global financial crisis, Bitcoin was introduced as a concept. And while there isn't a direct correlation between the Great Recession and the advent of Bitcoin, it is noteworthy that as the world encountered its greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression, a new and revolutionary form of currency would find its legs. In this video, I'll discuss the function of currency. We all know about money. Whether or not you have a little of it or a lot of it, we all know it's necessary to participate in society. It's the way we assign value and trade for goods and services. And while it's been that way for a long, long time, how we use money today is vastly different than the way we did even 40 years ago. But why is money valuable? The paper it's printed on is worthless, and standard coinage is no longer created from precious metals like silver and gold, but rather relatively worthless metal like copper and nickel. New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia, and Canada, for example, have discontinued the use of their smallest unit of currency, the penny, due in part to the fact that the penny cost more to manufacture than it was actually worth. but really because inflation made the penny a practically useless form of currency. There's also been a heated debate in the United States about discontinuing the penny there, but there are currently no plans to do that. So why is money valuable if the medium it's printed on is relatively worthless? Simple, because people accept its value, and that starts with the governments and banks that create and use it. Money is much more than a tool for bartering and exchanging things, however. It's how value is measured. For example, if there's a TV set that you want to buy and it costs $1,000, then that's how the manufacturer and retailer value it, and you have to decide if you want it enough and value it enough to pay $1,000. More than that, money is used to create and house wealth. The value or worth of people and corporations is measured by monetary worth. Banks were created because of trade, because people didn't want to walk around carrying large sums of money or gold with them, and banks were there to issue loans and accept deposits, creating a place to house one's wealth. And money was lent based on deposits held, and banknotes represented the deposits. As far as currency types, paper money became commonplace around the 11th century Common Era, and it's still being used today. And banknotes were originally a direct issue from banks themselves and not governments. At one point, in fact, there were more than 4,500 different kinds of banknotes in the USA alone, so there wasn't a common currency to speak of. Notes issued by private banks were eventually replaced by government-issued notes, however, as a way of standardizing currency so that all banks use the same notes, and therefore the value of the notes could be standardized and not linked to the private institutions. So today we have legal tender, and that simply means that it's a government-backed way of having universal payments and universal value. Legal tender is just what it states, too. It's the legal form of currency, and so must be accepted as payment for goods and services. Money has evolved over the years, though, to become what it is today. The first paper notes were based on a gold or silver exchange standard, and many countries use gold as a standard for the currencies. That practice was largely abandoned in the 20th century, however, and while many countries still hold large gold reserves, the US for example, today's currency isn't directly linked to gold. As far as cross-border trading of currency goes, it's noteworthy that monetary units of currency are usually issued by a country and only legal tender in that country. So the US dollar is legal tender in the US, the Canadian dollar is legal tender in Canada, and the Australian dollar is legal tender in Australia, but none of those currencies are legal tender outside their respective countries' borders. With that being said, foreign currencies are still used for trade because the currencies are government-backed and therefore have real value. But people, banks, businesses, and other entities choose whether or not to accept another nation's currencies. The US dollar, for example, is widely accepted as a payment method throughout the world as the global currency because those entities chose to accept it. For example, in Canada, the American dollar will be accepted not only at banks, but at virtually every business right down to retail businesses because even though it's not legal tender in Canada, it has a very real value and can be deposited in banks or used to make purchases at other businesses. The same cannot be said of other currencies. You won't find many businesses in the US, for example, that accept the Canadian dollar, just some near that rely on cross-border shopping. And you won't find businesses in Canada, at least not retail businesses, that accept the British pound or euro. Modern money has taken on a whole new complexity and dynamic with the widespread use of computers in the latter part of the 20th century, creating an environment where money could be traded electronically without the use of physical exchange like hard currency, banknotes, checks, and so on. EFT really exploded in the 1980s onward, and computer visionary Alvin Toffler speculated at the time that the world would be a cashless society by the early 21st century. While that prediction hasn't entirely come true, we still use cash for some things, it's easy now to see how there will come a time when cash money is all but obsolete. Modern computer systems transfer huge, vast amounts of money every day without the need for human intervention or exchange of physical monetary instruments. And of course, the latest instrument to take the world by storm is cryptocurrency, money with value that's transferred entirely without a physical form. Although there are physical bitcoins, for example, Bitcoin itself is entirely based on electronic transfer of value protected by cryptography. In this video, I'll introduce you to distributed consensus. Distributed consensus is a computer science term, which I'll describe momentarily. But it's important to know about distributed consensus because it's a crucial piece of the cryptocurrency puzzle. Bitcoin needs it in order to function, and the principle of distributed consensus has led to other cryptocurrencies that you may not be aware of. Most people have heard of Bitcoin, but would it surprise you to know that today there are more than 700 forms of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin? These are a few examples. Litecoin, Ripple, Aurora Coin, Namecoin, and Ethereum are just a few, and like Bitcoin, they rely on distributed consensus to work. Now, while there are many forms of digital cryptocurrency, it's important to know that few of them have a significant footprint, with less than 10 of them holding a market capitalization in excess of 10 million. So it's probably safe to say that most of these will disappear naturally, and in the future it may be the case that we're left with a much smaller number of cryptocurrencies. Or maybe we won't, who knows. In order to understand distributed consensus, we need to understand the meaning of consensus. Effectively, consensus means that most everybody is in agreement. In terms of cryptocurrency, consensus describes the way that every player in that currency is involved in the decision-making process. Think communities that come together to make decisions, in this case, on the value of the cryptocurrency, and those decisions are commonly accepted. That doesn't mean that everybody agrees, because consensus only means that a majority comes to a decision. Which makes sense, because if every single entity involved had to agree all the time, decisions would likely never be made. So let's look at the computer side of consensus. In terms of cryptocurrency, consensus refers to decisions made by computer nodes that are all part of a large network of systems. There's a centralized computer which collects the consensus, the results of a decision if you will, and then propagates or distributes the consensus to the entire network, thus the distributed part of distributed consensus. And you can think of the decision-making process as being very similar to the way a group of humans would come to a consensus. Not every participant has to agree with the consensus decision, just a majority, and the central computer acts as a chairperson of sorts to take the consensus and decide whether to accept it and distribute it to the collective. Now, that all sounds well and good, but there are notable problems with distributed consensus. First, there must be a reliable outcome every time, and that speaks to the complexity involved with having multiple participating entities or nodes. Think about a boardroom meeting where there are 10 people trying to reach a consensus, with an 11th, the chairperson, acting as a tiebreaker. It's not difficult to come to a consensus in such a scenario, but it's not always easy either, because every player may have their own agenda. Now imagine a boardroom with 10,000 people and one chairperson. How about 100,000? See the problem? Simply put, complexity. In distributed consensus, you have to ask if all the nodes can be trusted, thinking back to what I said about a board of directors, each with his or her own agenda. What if a distributed system of 1,000 computer nodes had 90% trustworthy nodes? That's a pretty high percentage for any scenario. 90% agreement on anything is pretty rare. But that means that of those 1,000 computers, 100 of them aren't trustworthy. Another potential issue with distributed consensus is that ownership has to be agreed upon in a constant and consistent manner, meaning that you're talking about currencies, money, flying around and being exchanged in the distributed system. Distributed consensus needs, every time, to ensure that if I send you 10 Bitcoin, for example, that those 10 Bitcoin no longer belong to me and they always belong to you. There has to be a perfect system, if you will, where every transaction has a 100% chance of being accepted. And that brings into focus the fact that there cannot be double spending, meaning that if I purchase something from you for 10 Bitcoin, I cannot purchase something else from someone else for the same 10 Bitcoin. In this video, I'll discuss price derivation. Have you ever wondered how money gets its value? Currencies are traded globally, meaning that different countries and international entities are trading yen for US dollars, euros for pesos, and so on. So how does that work? When we talk about the value of one's currency against another's, we talk in terms of exchange rates, the way one currency is priced and traded against another. And exchange rates fluctuate on a constant basis. In the course of a day, the US dollar will rise and fall in value against the Australian dollar, for example, and the same US dollar will rise and fall in value against the Chinese yuan. But exchange rates have more purpose than setting one's currency price against another's. It's also used to measure the economic health of a specific currency, and therefore the economic health of the country that issues the currency, and it's used to compare the economies of different countries. For example, we can say in general terms that the U.S. economy has gained strength over the Canadian economy in the past 2 years because the U.S. dollar has significantly increased in value against the value of the Canadian dollar, because the U.S. dollar has more buying power than the Canadian dollar. But how is the price or value of currencies established? Again, currency is traded between international entities, and there's a foreign exchange market, which is by far the largest market in the world, where buyers and sellers exchange currencies from different countries. The foreign exchange market trades on a 24-hour cycle, 5 days a week, from Monday to Friday. There's something called the spot exchange rate, which is the current exchange rate or current value of one's currency against another. And then there's the forward exchange rate, which is the rate at which a currency trades today, but it's based on a date in the future. In other words, two parties agree to exchange a set number of units of a currency, say €1,000,000 for $109, the price agreed upon today. But the actual exchange of the $1,000,000 is set to be enacted a month from now, for example, and a month from now, that's the agreed upon price, regardless of how much the two currencies are valued against each other today. The foreign exchange market is commonly known as the currency market, FX, or Forex. It's decentralized, meaning that there's no government or governments controlling the exchange, and its main players are large banks and other financial institutions. The Forex doesn't actually set the value of currencies, though. It merely reports the market prices of currencies against other currencies, and that price is based on demand. Greater demand for British pounds, and the value of the British pound goes up. Greater demand for British pounds, and the value of the British pound goes up because buyers are willing to pay more for them. Less demand for the euro means less people want to buy it, and therefore sellers are going to settle for a lower price. And like any commodity, the price or value of a currency is based on several factors, including economic conditions and geopolitical conditions. And so internal and external factors can affect the price of a currency. For example, the Brexit vote resulted in a drop in value of the British pound against other currencies, and the economic problems in Greece have affected the value of the euro, which is legal tender in EU countries. But while the euro's value declined due to Greece, the continuing economic problems in Greece and other EU nations could increase the value of the US dollar against the euro. And in Canada, which for years has seen its dollar value based roughly on oil production, has seen a drastic decline in the value of the Canadian dollar when the price of oil reached rock bottom back in 2015. The price of oil didn't affect the value of the US dollar, at least not significantly, however, because Canada is more dependent on selling its oil to foreign markets than the United States. And that's the whole point. Exchange rates are how currencies are valued against each other, and here you can see the exchange rate of euros versus US dollars. On the left-hand side, $1 is currently worth around 0.89 euros, so $10 is worth 8.94 euros. But if you flip it, as you can see on the right-hand side, €1 is worth roughly $1.11 US, meaning 10 euros is worth $11.18. Now, I want to talk about the US dollar for a moment, because while it's only legal tender in the United States, it's currently accepted in virtually every nation as if it was legal tender, making it the de facto global currency. The reason for this is because countries routinely stockpile reserve currency, that is, currencies that are considered a safe investment, and it's attractive as a way of performing one-to-one transactions, buying things from the US or other countries that accept US dollars, instead of your own currency, which can be subject to fluctuation. But while the US dollar has long been considered the safe currency for purposes of holding and trading, it's not the only one, and other reserve currencies include euros, the Japanese yen, the Chinese yuan, the British pound, and the Canadian dollar, for the same reasons as holding US dollars. These currencies are all strong and from economically secure countries, generally speaking. And it's worth noting that while the US dollar has always been at the top of the heap in terms of its value as a reserve currency, that things have changed a bit. In 2000, 70% of reserve currency in the world was in US dollars, and in 2015, that number dropped by 6 percentage points, perhaps indicating that nations are trying to be more diverse in their foreign reserves. In this video, I'll discuss what blockchain is. So what is blockchain and what does it offer? Well, first, it's a distributed database, and by distributed, I mean that the database is shared by many different devices or computer nodes. It's open sourced, meaning that anyone can access the blockchain and modify it, provided that they're part of the blockchain network. Like every database, the blockchain contains records called blocks, and the collection of blocks grows continually. The blockchain is a secure environment where tampering or unauthorized modification of the database isn't permitted. The blockchain is used by every node in the system. There's no central location for the data, and every device has a copy of the database. And the blockchain contains the entire history of a system, from the moment it was created up until now. Now, let's talk about blockchain and Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is the most obvious example of blockchain technology in action. It's the underlying technology behind Bitcoin, and it was Bitcoin that drove the creation of blockchain. The Bitcoin blockchain contains all the Bitcoin transactions that have been recorded since the day it was created, which was January 3rd, 2009. And transactions aren't recorded until they're added to the blockchain, ensuring that there are no false entries. Every block, that is every transaction, is timestamped and linked to the block before it, and is safe because every node in the blockchain has a copy of it. So, how does blockchain work? Well, it's a public ledger with no central authority, meaning that there's no one master owner of the database. It's so innovative and secure, in fact, that large financial institutions are already experimenting with blockchain technology to see how they can leverage it. And that includes working with cryptocurrencies. So here's how a transaction is created and added to the blockchain. First, imagine that someone sends a payment of X amount of bitcoins to someone else. All the nodes on the blockchain receive notification of the transaction. The transaction is validated through distributed consensus and then recorded in the blockchain as a new block. Finally, the nodes propagate or distribute the blockchain transaction to other nodes so that every node in the Bitcoin blockchain have a matching copy of the blockchain with the new transaction. Now, let's dig a little deeper. That all sounds pretty straightforward when you're talking about a single transaction with a few nodes, but what about thousands of transactions occurring in real time over a network that has potentially millions of nodes? Well, that's what makes blockchain so interesting and effective. The transactions are broadcast 5 to 6 times an hour in the case of Bitcoin, so roughly every 10 minutes, which makes sense because you don't really want to be continuously updating the database in real time with every new transaction when thousands or millions of transactions are occurring. It would bog down the network and result in never-ending processing. At each interval, the new blocks are tacked onto the end of the blockchain, and then the blockchain is propagated to the entire network. Double spending, the practice of using bitcoins to make a purchase and then using the same bitcoins to make another purchase, isn't permitted, and this is enforced by ensuring that all the nodes in the blockchain have a current copy of the transactions. There are various applications that can be used with blockchain for mining bitcoins, and these applications are called wallets. And you might wonder how this database that's shared with so many computers could be safe from malicious attackers, and that's a valid concern. But blockchain security is guaranteed by its complexity. Remember, everyone has a copy of the database, so the amount of computational power it would take to attack and change the database makes the chances of attacking the blockchain pretty much nil. In this video, I'll provide examples of blockchain. The term blockchain is in itself a general term, not linked to any one application. It simply refers to an open-source distributed database and the underlying technology that manages it. And the term blockchain can mean different things to different people. As you learn more about blockchain, you'll understand why that is, because Bitcoin is far from the only practical use for blockchain technology. But this adds to the confusion because Bitcoin was the technology that drove the invention of the blockchain, and the two are often used synonymously. But the term blockchain usually refers to distributed ledgers or databases, where the blockchain ledger or database is propagated to every node in a network, with every node holding a copy of the ledger. Again, with Bitcoin being one and the most well-known example of blockchain in action. So let's start with Bitcoin because it is the most widely known example. Bitcoin was introduced in 2008, and it's the most well-known example of a cryptocurrency. It's open source and peer-to-peer, meaning that every participant in the Bitcoin blockchain share a copy of the blockchain ledger. Bitcoin, of course, has to have some value in the real world, and today, one Bitcoin, which is represented by the symbol BTC, is worth about $700 US. And it almost reached $1,000 back in 2013. And you will hear of physical Bitcoins, but they're something of a minor fad with a small niche appeal. There are about a dozen companies that make and sell them, but in essence, Bitcoin is a digital commodity. Another well-known example of blockchain in action is Ethereum, which was created in 2014. It got its start through crowdfunding and is a public blockchain just like Bitcoin. Ethereum runs on a decentralized virtual machine known as the Ethereum Virtual Machine, and Ethereum is basically a decentralized system for storing smart contracts. Smart contracts are contracts which are contained as software or data that's placed on the blockchain, and they make contracts legally binding and enforceable because, remember, a blockchain contains a record of every transaction since the beginning of time, and the blockchain is impervious to tampering. So once a contract is distributed to the blockchain, it cannot be changed. Ethereum also has its own cryptocurrency called Ether, and Ethereum is used and accessed through an Ethereum client application. Another interesting use of blockchain is the interplanetary file system, which is also a distributed P2P system and open source. It's also a decentralized system that's used for file sharing, with every connected node having access to the file system. The IPFS is useful because it reduces the risk of duplicate files and instead has a version history. It's effectively a high-performance way of storing and sharing files. And IPFS is commonly compared to the World Wide Web because it provides a distributed system that anyone in the world can access and use to find, create, and share files. So these are some of the more well-known applications of blockchain, but they only represent the tip of the iceberg, and as blockchain becomes more common, we're going to see some extremely interesting uses for this revolutionary technology. In this video, I'll discuss the benefits of blockchain. Blockchain is a distributed ledger system, meaning that every computer device in the blockchain contains a copy of the database. It's public and open source, so it's widely available. And it keeps a record of every transaction, meaning that every computer or device on the blockchain has a current copy of all transactions since the time the blockchain was created. It continually validates itself, ensuring that all transactions are recorded, and this means that the blockchain ledger is reliable. You know that your copy and every other copy on the blockchain is the current and valid record of all transactions. It also leads to data integrity because there's virtually zero risk of the blockchain ledger becoming corrupted. It's secure because the nature of the distributed database is that it can't be tampered with. All the nodes, that is, computers on the blockchain, are constantly updating and verifying the blockchain ledger. And this means that the blockchain ledger is immutable. Again, it cannot be changed without the consensus from all devices on the blockchain. In terms of the way that transactions are authorized, they're quick, with the blockchain updating on regular intervals. So it's essentially updating in real time or near real time. The Bitcoin blockchain, for example, updates roughly every 10 minutes. The blockchain provides non-repudiation. That is, you cannot dispute that you did or did not perform a transaction because every transaction is contained on every node. It prevents duplication. You cannot have a transaction that's recorded twice, say using the same bitcoins for multiple transactions, so there's no double spending. It provides transparency because every node sees, if you will, all the transactions. And it has public visibility. When everyone has access to the database and all of its transactions, everyone can have confidence that the database and the transactions it contains are legitimate. Blockchain is decentralized. There's no one computer or device on the blockchain that owns the ledger because everyone has a copy. It's highly available, meaning that even if nodes on the blockchain are down, it won't deter the blockchain from operating properly. And every transaction between parties is guaranteed, resulting in high confidence on the blockchain system. There are no middlemen. In other more traditional systems, say purchasing stocks or monetary instruments, there are always middlemen, banks, brokers, and other parties that take a cut of every transaction. That's not the case in blockchain technology, meaning that transactions aren't subject to the markups that you will find when you purchase foreign currency from a bank, for example. The bank will never give you the market exchange rate because it makes money off selling you the currency. And this all results in a lower risk for every party that participates in the blockchain. And all this leads back to security, because the blockchain is relatively new, and in any novel system, people are understandably skittish about adopting it, especially when money is involved, like with Bitcoin or Ether. The blockchain is immutable, meaning that it cannot be altered, at least not maliciously. While the blockchain is being altered constantly, it's through distributed consensus, so you know that any changes being made have been reviewed and authorized by the nodes on the blockchain. And blockchain offers trustless transactions, which may sound like a bad thing, but it's not. It means that you don't need to have pre-established trust with a party to know a transaction is valid. And the risk of malicious attacks is relatively small. I don't want to say that the blockchain is perfectly safe merely because hackers are notorious for finding ways to break systems, but the way in which the blockchain is updated by having no central authority and consensus among all the nodes makes it highly unlikely that a blockchain could be altered maliciously. The entire system really provides freedom and control for its users, with every user having a say, if you will, in the transactions that propagate the blockchain ledger. And this all means that there's practically zero risk of any failure points in the system, a badly behaved computer, for example, altering the data in a harmful way. In this video, I'll discuss the public blockchain. In very basic terms, blockchain has two different types of implementations, public and private blockchain. So let's talk about the public blockchain. Public simply means that it's open to the public. Anyone can participate, think Bitcoin for example. All you need to do to access and buy and sell Bitcoins is have a client known as a wallet. And this means that anyone can own a copy of the blockchain ledger. And I've used quotes around own because no one entity actually owns the public blockchain. Rather, everyone owns it in the sense that every node in the blockchain has a copy of the distributed database. And every node writes to the database when transactions occur. This also means that if you participate in the blockchain, anyone can write to your blockchain in the same way you can write to theirs. This is because the blockchain ledger has to contain every single transaction that has occurred, and the transactions are distributed out to nodes, with that information being written to your ledger and everyone else's ledger. It's an elegant solution to a difficult problem, and that's why blockchain is such an interesting and game-changing technology. In this video, I'll discuss the private blockchain. We can think about blockchain as having two basic forms, if you will, and therefore two different basic implementations. The first is public, a perfect example being Bitcoin, which is a public blockchain that anyone can participate in. That's been the most well-known example of blockchain in action, so it's understandable that you might think of every blockchain as being a public system, but that's not the case. In the private blockchain, you can use blockchain technology in an isolated environment, for example, a corporation or other entity setting up a blockchain for its own uses. In the private blockchain, unlike the public blockchain, every node participating in the blockchain is known and trusted. Entities that might want to take advantage of a private blockchain environment include banks and companies, industry groups, governments, and non-governmental organizations. And the blockchain is attractive to organizations because they can enforce the blockchain through things like access permissions and contractual obligations. Think about a company, for example, that establishes a private blockchain that's used to validate and store some sort of transactions. Maybe supply chain and logistics would be a good example. Large companies that are ordering massive amounts of materials and parts, and they're constantly being shipped to various plants from the supplier's locations. That company could give every supplier access to their private blockchain through username and password, and every transaction, every item ordered, processed, shipped, and received is recorded in the blockchain. Smart contracts could be part of that blockchain, and that's very attractive to an organization because you can go into the blockchain at any time and see what was shipped and when and where, and have every non-refutable transaction being recorded. Non-repudiation. A supplier can come back and say, hey, I shipped this at such and such a time, and you can pull up the transaction and show them exactly when the shipment left their facility. That's just one example of how a private blockchain might be used, and I don't know if any companies are actually doing that right now, but it's an interesting idea that takes ERP to a whole new level if you can attach contractual obligations to it and have a secure system that only specific users are given access. In this video, I'll discuss the hybrid blockchain. There are two basic implementations of blockchain, and I'm talking here in terms of how the blockchain is accessed. public blockchains like Bitcoin, where everyone can have access to the blockchain through a software client known as a wallet, in Bitcoin's case, and private blockchains, where organizations or entities control who can access the blockchain. And it may have occurred to you that you could implement a hybrid blockchain, that is a mix of public and private blockchains, and you'd be correct. In a hybrid blockchain, read and write access of the blockchain ledger are controlled. That is, nodes in the public end of the blockchain would have read-only access to the private blockchain. They could access it, but not change it, and only authorized member nodes of the private blockchain could read and write. Now, how might this be implemented and who would want it? Well, groups of organizations might want to provide read-only access to certain members, like a company that gives its customers read-only access to their blockchain, while read and write access would be provided to internal clients, employees of the organization, for example, and perhaps suppliers as well. So customers could see when an item shipped and track its progress, for example, while suppliers could actually update shipping progress. This would be a useful way of developing different models of blockchain implementation, and there's no telling how it could be used, but it's safe to say that you'll see examples of hybrid blockchains popping up in the future. It has the important virtue of creating a collaborative environment where many different players could participate in the blockchain while still providing the safety and security of controlling who has access to what features of the distributed database. In this video, I'll discuss blockchain and commodities. So let's talk about blockchain and commodities. What are commodities? Well, they're any real-world item. Examples of common commodities are gold, silver, or precious stones, as well as raw materials like lumber and pork bellies. They're all commodities, real-world items with an associated value. And that's important to understand because blockchain is going beyond the digital universe where non-physical items like bitcoins are traded. Blockchain is actually getting into the commodities trade. Why is that? Well, for starters, commodities trading has a cost associated with it. In commodities markets, there are many hands, all playing a part in the way that a commodity gets from its original source to a purchaser. Think about farm produce, eggs for example. They start with the farmer, but then get purchased in large volume in a marketplace, and then get sold to different supermarket chains, and there are shippers and agents involved all along the way, different third parties that all take their cut. With each intermediary, the final price of the product gets marked up, and that burden is passed on to the consumer, the person who walks into a supermarket and buys a carton of eggs. Well, blockchain can be applied to real-world items, to commodities, and it's secure, and transactions are guaranteed. Once they've been distributed to the blockchain ledger, they cannot be repudiated, because everyone in the blockchain has a current copy of all the transactions, and this reduces the risk of tampering with the blockchain database. Here's how it might work. In a futures market, a market that trades in commodities, the blockchain would control both sides of the transaction, from the producer, the farmer in my previous example, and the buyer, the supermarket, for example. A consortium could be established of producers, many farmers, and buyers, many supermarkets, and it could be public, private, or a hybrid blockchain. The obvious benefit to such a scenario is that certain third parties, the intermediaries, are removed from the process, and therefore the markups associated with these third parties are eradicated, and no or little additional fees are incurred, meaning the consumer, the end user in this example, pays a lower price. The blockchain transactions would be directly associated with the physical commodities, though, so things like delivery, receipt of products, transfer of ownership would have to be validated, and this would all be done through blockchain technology, which is safe and secure. The blockchain would have to be updated, of course, with every transaction, and that's what blockchain does, and it does it very well. Now, there are a few things to consider. Modern financial systems operate in the ether, that is, financial transactions are done without paper or hard currency. There are no physical transfers of assets because electronic funds transfers don't need it. In modern stock trading, for example, when you purchase stock in a company, you don't actually receive a stack of paper, but the ownership of X amount of shares is transferred to your name. On the other hand, commodities markets deal exclusively in physical items that must go from one place to another when ownership changes. Things like oil drums, gold, grain, and other commodities, when purchased by a party, usually means having to ship that commodity from the seller to the buyer. And that creates a few potential problems in the commodities blockchain scenario, or at least issues that need to be addressed and potential solutions. There's a higher risk of double spending, for example, because now we're talking about a physical item that needs to be shipped somewhere when ownership changes. In Bitcoin, double spending isn't possible because the blockchain is updated in near real time every 10 minutes or so. But shipping hard items from one place to another, transferring ownership, is a transaction that could take days or weeks, and that makes the Bitcoin model of regular updates more impractical. And because of that, fraudulent activity is a real concern in traditional commodities markets. So how could these issues be resolved? Well, like anything else, a transparent organization that oversees the transfer of commodities and updating of the blockchain could be put in place with checks to reduce the risk of fraud. Or probably more realistic, a private and therefore trusted blockchain could be established through a consortium that acts as the central authority. And while I've been talking about this as if it's hypothetical, there are actually organizations already trading in commodities using blockchain. Gold Block, for example, trades in a cryptocurrency that's secured by gold, and Uphold is a system that trades in money and commodities. And these are only two examples. It's happening now, and it will be interesting to see where commodities trading with blockchain technology goes in the future. In this video, I'll describe the benefits of blockchain and why it provides a secure collaborative environment. So let's talk about why blockchain is such a dramatic new technology that's caught the attention of financial institutions and organizations. For starters, it's an online infrastructure that can be used to validate and verify transactions of virtually any kind. Some examples include the most obvious one, obvious because it was the first practical implementation of blockchain, and that's cryptocurrency. There are over 700 in existence today, and these are just a few. Obviously, Bitcoin is the big one, but you also have Ethereum, Ripple, Primecoin, Mazacoin, and Namecoin. And it's being used in commodities trading, for example, organizations like Gold Block and Uphold. And there are others in existence or springing up all the time. And there are even more examples of organizations that have implemented or will implement some sort of blockchain environment. Smart contracts through Ethereum, file storage and sharing through the Interplanetary File System, and other organizations like NASDAQ, Visa, DocuSign, and USAA. So it's safe to say that blockchain technology can no longer be referred to as nascent technology, but where it will go in the future is anybody's guess. Blockchain is a breakthrough technology. There's no getting around it because it solves several problems that organizations need to have solved in order for it to be useful. Verification and validation, security, frequent and regular broadcasting, the complete storage of transactions, and the negation of double spending risk are all critical components to the blockchain ecosystem. Furthermore, it's open source, meaning that organizations can take the technology and develop it for their own purposes, creating an environment of use cases that we haven't even begun to see flower. There's no ruling authority, and it inspires collaboration, and it's going to be exciting to see where developers and organizations take this technology. Additionally, blockchain provides complete and utter transparency, so transactions between complete strangers have an aura of trust. Blockchain ledgers are searchable and contain a complete and permanent record of every transaction. It provides validation and authentication, effectively erasing the risk of counterfeiting. And there's no need for third-party intermediaries, reducing the costs usually incurred by fees associated with middlemen. It's extremely secure, with no risk of tampering, and no risk of hacking. And in its totality, blockchain offers a solution in need of problems. If current implementations are any indication, you will see lots and lots of blockchain solutions appear in the very near future. In this video, I'll discuss market forecasting. In finance, market forecasting is the act of predicting potential outcomes. It's the primary activity of market analysis and predicts things like trends and values, the various elements of monetary instruments or commodities. Forecasts are generated for a period of time, often 3 or more years out. And when we think about forecasting, it's important to remember that they are merely estimates. They are predictions and therefore not perfect, nor are they meant to be. By the 2020s, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, blockchain technology will be widely used by enterprises, performing activities that blockchain does very well, namely validation and verification of information. And the capital markets investments in developing blockchain technology will reach $1 billion this year. So with so much focus on the benefits of blockchain, it's not surprising that forecasting has arrived on the radar for some companies. Remember, blockchain is a record that contains every transaction that occurred since the blockchain was created. So it can contain extremely valuable data about trends, and that data can be analyzed to predict future outcomes. And it's not money and commodities that are being traded. For example, Augur Technologies has created a blockchain platform for decentralized predictions markets. Now, that may sound a bit odd, but what they've done is very intriguing. The technology is based on the Ethereum platform, and Augur's technology can be used to buy shares in real events like elections, sporting events, entertainment, and other areas. It's a very interesting idea and demonstrates how customized markets can be created. In this case, the market is buying and selling predictions on things that happen in the real world. Shares are bought and paid for in real dollars, so you can make money on it if you predict wisely. The way it works is that shares are sold based on probability, and that's how pricing is set. So if you were buying a share on a sporting event stating that a specific team would win, for example, and that share was 50 cents, then there's a 50% probability on the outcome that the team you picked would win. If you're right, you get $1 back for every share you purchased. Their basic concept is that predictions made by a group or crowd of people are more accurate than predictions made by individuals, and they plan to leverage that technology so it can be used in real-world fields such as finance or healthcare. In this video, I'll discuss blockchain adoption. There's so much discussion surrounding blockchain technology, and it's gaining momentum quickly. So let's talk about how it's been received and how it's being adopted, because the uptake on blockchain is far outstripping predictions on how quickly it would be picked up. By the 2020s, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, blockchain technology will be a common tool used by enterprises for a variety of purposes where validation and verification is required. And investments in developing blockchain technology are predicted to reach $1 billion this year. IBM surveyed 200 banks and reports that 15% of banks and 14% of financial institutions have plans to implement some sort of blockchain solution by next year. Here are some of the early adopters of blockchain technology. The U.S. Federal Reserve is working in conjunction with IBM to build a digital payment system. IBM has built its own blockchain technology that can be used by enterprises to digitize transaction workflows. Visa is creating a business-to-business payment system. Stock exchanges NASDAQ and Australia's ASX have both announced the development of blockchain ledger technology. And banks are rapidly adopting and developing blockchain solutions. The list here representing some of the earliest players, but expect to see this list grow significantly over the next couple of years. Consulting firm McKinsey & Company believes that there will be 4 stages of gradual blockchain adoption as the technology becomes more commonplace and organizations commit to using it. We're already seeing much of this in play. First, companies will develop the technology internally and implement and test it among their own legal entities, different divisions, and geographical locations, for example. Then, banks will adopt the technology, perhaps as a way of phasing out manual processes, using small networks to start with to test the technology implementation. Then, there will be conversion of inter-dealer settlements, as McKinsey calls it, which will see collaboration among players in small networks to create standards around blockchain technology. Finally, there will be large-scale adoption where the financial industry as a whole will disseminate blockchain technology out to end users, effectively making it a standard that everyone will use. So these 4 steps are an interesting approach to how blockchain can and might end up becoming a universal technology, but let's see what's already happened. Here are some of the interesting things that companies have been doing with blockchain. The U.S. Federal Reserve, as I mentioned earlier, is working with IBM to develop a payment system. Barclays Bank has established 2 Bitcoin labs in London where blockchain coders and companies can work to develop new technologies. IBM has created the IBM blockchain, offering technology that can create digitized transaction workflows for enterprises. NASDAQ has developed the Link blockchain ledger for sales of shares. Funderbeam has launched the world's first blockchain investment platform. And Citibank has established 3 blockchain systems and developed their own cryptocurrency called Citicoin. In this video, I'll discuss the early days of Bitcoin. Bitcoin may not be that old, relatively speaking, but it already has a long and fascinating history. So let's take a look at some of the notable events surrounding the digital currency since it was first announced in 2008. In August of that year, Bitcoin.org was officially registered. And in October, an unknown person or persons going by the name Satoshi Nakamoto published the white paper that started it all, explaining the Bitcoin system. In January of 2009, the Genesis block, the very first Bitcoin block, was mined, and a week later, an open source implementation of Bitcoin was released. Within days of that, the very first Bitcoin transaction for a total of 10 Bitcoins was recorded. Nakamoto, by the way, is reported to have mined 1 million Bitcoins in the early days, which could be worth more than $700 million today. Later in 2009, in October, the Bitcoin exchange rate was set for the first time, valued at 1,300 Bitcoins to $1. Around the same time, the Bitcoin Developers Channel opened on Internet Relay Chat. In 2010, Bitcoin began to get its legs. In February, the Bitcoin Market Currency Exchange was launched, and an encryption patent for Bitcoin was published. In May, the first real-world Bitcoin transaction was used to purchase a pizza for 10,000 Bitcoins, which would be worth roughly $7 million today, so that's an expensive pizza. July saw a sudden surge in Bitcoin users, and the value of Bitcoins increased tenfold when the value jumped from 8,000ths of a cent to 800ths of a cent. In August, a vulnerability in Bitcoin surrounding verification was used to generate 184 billion Bitcoins. In October 2010, the International Group Financial Action Task Force warned that digital currencies could be used for money laundering to fund terrorist activities. And Bitcoin's value, which had been stagnant of late, began to rise. In the same month, the group Bitcoin OTC, a market for over-the-counter trading of Bitcoins, launched on IRC, and the first short sale of Bitcoins was recorded. In November, the market capitalization reached $1 million for the first time. In 2011, in January, the largest trade to date for Bitcoins was recorded on the Bitcoin OTC channel, totaling 3 Zim dollars, a currency note worth 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars. Keep in mind that was Zimbabwean dollars, which had reached an era of hyperinflation. In February, 1 Bitcoin was finally worth $1, and the first automobile for sale using Bitcoins was offered online. In March, the Bitcoin market website underwent a major overhaul, and in April, Bitcoin reached parity with the euro and pound sterling. June was a busy month. On the 13th, a Bitcoin user reported that 25,000 Bitcoins had been stolen from his wallet, at the time worth almost $400,000. On the 19th, Mt. Gox, the now-defunct Bitcoin exchange that at one time handled more than 65% of all Bitcoin transactions, announced a major breach that leaked the personal information of more than 50,000 users, and had to be shut down for a week. And on the 29th, the first mobile e-wallet, BitPay, launched. In July, the Polish Bitcoin exchange Bitomat lost 17,000 of its clients' Bitcoins. And in August, the now non-existent MyBitcoin, one of the earliest wallets, lost more than 150,000 Bitcoins in a hack worth $2 million. Later in the month, the first Bitcoin conference and World Expo opened in New York City. And in September, the first minted Bitcoins called Cassatius were made available. And in November 2010, the Bitcoin and Future Technology European Conference was held in Prague, Czech Republic. In this video, I'll discuss the impact of Bitcoin. Let's discuss the finer points of Bitcoin and the impact it's had. Now, before we begin, I want to discuss the capitalization for a minute because you may have seen Bitcoin written both with a capital B and a lowercase b. So to help sort that out, when you use the word with a capital B, it refers to the general Bitcoin technology and the Bitcoin community. When you talk about the actual currency, Bitcoins, a lowercase b is used. Bitcoin was the first decentralized digital currency, and it's important to create that distinction because it wasn't the first digital currency. Rather, it was the first to use a system with no central authority, the underlying backbone of the blockchain technology. The earliest cryptocurrency was DigiCash, introduced in 1994, followed by eGold, Ripple, which became OpenCoin, Qcoin, and then Liberty Reserve. So there were plenty of predecessors to Bitcoin, but none which offered the revolutionary and secure way in which Bitcoin is used. And taking a look at Bitcoin's progress over the years, there were several notable events. In 2011, cryptocurrencies based on Bitcoin source code began to appear, and the Silk Road Drug Marketplace, a black market for illegal drugs, opened. That's notable because the marketplace traded in Bitcoins. In 2012, the first Bitcoin debit cards were announced and the Bitcoin Foundation launched. In 2013, the Bitcoin market cap exceeded 10 billion US dollars for the first time, and the value of a single Bitcoin reached all-time high of nearly 1,100 US dollars. In 2014, facing charges of money laundering using Bitcoins, Charlie Shrem resigned from the Bitcoin Foundation, of which he was a founder, and Mt. Gox, one of the largest Bitcoin exchanges at the time, filed for bankruptcy protection after more than 700,000 Bitcoins were stolen. And in 2015, Coinbase of San Francisco launched the first regulated Bitcoin exchange in the United States, and Barclays Bank became the first bank in the United Kingdom to accept Bitcoins. In this video, I'll discuss notable events surrounding Bitcoin. For a relatively young digital currency, Bitcoin already has a long and storied history, and understanding these events not only gives you a sense of where it's been, but in fact how much the cryptocurrency has grown through events both positive and negative. So let's take a look. In 2012, Trade Hill Bitcoin currency exchange closed its doors after facing regulatory issues and a loss of 100,000 US dollars. In the same year, Bitcoin Magazine launched, and a leaked FBI report cited concerns that the Bureau had over illegal drug and weapons purchase using Bitcoins. Users also filed a complaint against Bitcoinica, a now closed speculation service for Bitcoins, after the service lost large amounts of Bitcoins. And the Bitcoin Savings and Trust was investigated for conducting a Ponzi scheme, and the service later shut down. WordPress became one of the first major websites to accept Bitcoin, and Bitcoin Central, the first Bitcoin exchange, received licensing as a bank. In 2013, the Bitcoin market capitalization surpassed 1 billion US dollars for the first time and exceeded 10 billion US dollars by the end of the year. In April, Bitcoin's value crashed, losing 35% in value and reduced to little more than $4.50. It took 7 months for Bitcoin's value to rebound. Let's Talk Bitcoin, a regular podcast dealing with all things Bitcoin, aired, and FinCEN, the U.S. Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, created a policy on digital currencies. In the same year, Bitcoin reached its all-time high of 1,100 US dollars, and a $75 million lawsuit was launched against the disgraced Mt. Gox Bitcoin exchange. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security seized Mt. Gox assets valued at $2.9 million. Also in 2013, New York State's Department of Financial Services subpoenaed 22 Bitcoin companies to gain information about their operations and consumer safeguards. And the FBI closed down the Silk Road illegal drug marketplace, seizing $3.6 million. Baidu, China's largest search engine, began to accept Bitcoins, and the first Subway sandwich store began accepting Bitcoins. In the same year, the U.S. Senate held a hearing on the risks and threats of digital currency. Bitcoin's trading volume overtook that of Western Union's. And finally, China's central bank banned Bitcoins, and Baidu stopped accepting them. In 2014, Charlie Shrem and another man, both of BitInstant, were arrested on charges of money laundering and using Bitcoins for black market websites. And Shrem subsequently resigned from the Bitcoin Foundation he co-founded. Bitstamp, now the world's second largest Bitcoin exchange by volume, suspended its operations after a distributed denial of service attack. And BitPay sponsored the St. Petersburg Bowl, becoming the first Bitcoin provider to sponsor a sporting event. In 2015, Coinbase launched the first regulated Bitcoin exchange in the United States, and the New York State Department of Financial Services stated publicly that Coinbase was operating without a license in the state of New York. New York later established a Bit license, which all companies require in order to legally operate Bitcoin-based operations in the state. Finally, in that year, Barclays became the first UK-based bank to accept Bitcoins as payment. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin as a common form of currency. The true power of any currency is its acceptance or lack thereof. Currency is useless unless people will accept it as payment, and this is also true of cryptocurrencies. So let's talk about Bitcoin's acceptance as a common method for payment. We've seen plenty of examples of Bitcoin going legit, that is, being accepted as a legitimate payment form, and I'll show you some examples shortly. But important events that we've seen happen include the launch of the first Bitcoin ATM with a machine sold by a company called RoboCoin, opened in a coffee shop in Vancouver, Canada in 2013. And there have been a few instances where U.S. judges have weighed in on Bitcoin and its standing as a currency. Recently, a federal judge in New York ruled that Bitcoin is a form of money, while a district judge in Florida recently ruled that Bitcoin is not money. There are other examples, but the very fact that judges are making rulings on Bitcoin is in itself evidence of Bitcoin's establishment as a legitimate player. In 2015, Bloomberg listed Bitcoin at the top of its currency charts and established a Bitcoin tracker on its website. In 2014, Bitcoin gained official status as private money by the German Finance Ministry. And there are now more than 250 Bitcoin ATMs globally. In Cyprus, the University of Nicosia became the first university in the world to accept Bitcoin. And Virgin Galactic is even accepting Bitcoins for future space travel. Shopify, which has more than 70,000 merchants, has added Bitcoin as a payment option. And the first Bitcoin Black Friday happened in 2013, and now is a recurring event coinciding with the first Friday after American Thanksgiving. There are some notable companies that have been early adopters of Bitcoin by accepting Bitcoin as payment. These include Dell, Microsoft, WordPress, PizzaForCoins.com, Overstock.com, Expedia.com, Newegg.com, Mega, Internet Archive, Homeless Shelter Satoshi Forest, and OkCupid, to name a few, but the list is long and growing longer every day. In this video, I'll discuss known Bitcoin hacks. Bitcoin has a storied history, and it's not all good news. But to be realistic and fair, it's not unusual for nascent technologies to be subject to hacking. Keep in mind that these hacks don't suggest that there's a problem with blockchain technology. Blockchain is still safe and secure, but Bitcoin itself has been subject to hacks for any number of reasons. Maybe the technology implementations weren't secure, loopholes were discovered and exploited, or real-world crimes like fraud and Ponzi schemes were the product of human greed. Who knows? But encountering malicious intent is part of the natural process when bringing technology like Bitcoin to the real world. Unfortunately, that doesn't help the people who lost money. Studies suggest that more than 33% of Bitcoin exchanges have been hacked, and that's a pretty significant number. So let's look at some of the more prominent Bitcoin hacks to understand how the technology has experienced growing pains. In 2010, Bitcoin exploits resulted in 184 billion Bitcoins being created. In 2011, we begin to see a lot of troubling incidents, beginning with the now-defunct Mt. Gox, where a Bitcoin sale led to the speculation that a botnet was part of the network. Also in 2011, the Bitcoin market canceled trading of Bitcoins using PayPal due to fraudulent activity. Now, note that this was on the Bitcoin market side and that PayPal happily deals in Bitcoins today. Bitcoin user Alan Vane reported a theft of 25,000 Bitcoins worth about $375,000 US. And a Mt. Gox breach caused the Bitcoin price to drop from $17.51 to 1 cent, at which point it halted trading. And my Bitcoin suffered a 150,000 Bitcoin loss worth $2 million US. In 2012, Linode lost 46,000 Bitcoins worth $225,000 US. Bitcoinica lost 18,000 Bitcoins worth $90,000 US and was sued for $460,000. Bitfloor lost 24,000 Bitcoins worth $250,000 US, and BitInstant lost 12,000 US. In 2013, Inputs.io lost 4,100 Bitcoins worth $1 million US. Bips lost 1,295 Bitcoins worth $650,000 US. Pico stocks lost 6,000 Bitcoins worth $3 million US. And Sheep Marketplace lost 96,000 Bitcoins worth $100 million US. Keeping in mind here that the price of Bitcoin, the value of it, fluctuates, and so therefore some of these prices may differ in terms of the exchange rate, but you get the idea. Now, in February 2014, Mt. Gox reported that it experienced a hack and lost 744,000 Bitcoins worth $450 million. In 2015, Bitstamp lost 19,000 Bitcoins worth $5 million. BTER lost 7,100 Bitcoins worth $1.75 million US. And Purse.io lost 10,235 Bitcoins worth $2.5 million. And in August 2016, Bitfinex experienced a hack and lost 119,000 Bitcoins or $65 million US. Now that you've learned the basics of digital currency and blockchain, it's time to put some of that knowledge to work. In this exercise, you'll prepare responses to the following questions about digital currency and blockchain. First, what is the basic function of money? Briefly explain how digital consensus works. In addition to setting price, what are the other purposes of exchange rates? Why is blockchain data considered to be relatively safe? And why is Bitcoin considered to be pioneering even though other digital currencies preceded it? At this point, you can pause this video and perform the exercise. Once you're finished, resume the video and see how I would do it. So let's address these questions. You may not have answered in exactly the same way, and that's all right. First, what is the basic function of money? Well, my answer is money is currency that's used as a way to trade or exchange value for goods or services. Second question, briefly explain how digital consensus works. Well, digital consensus uses multiple decentralized computers that act as nodes, and each node comes together to reach a common consensus or reach agreements on transactions. Next, in addition to setting price, what are the other purposes of exchange rates? Well, first, exchange rates are used as an indicator of a country's economic health, or more specifically, the currency's economic health. And it's also used to compare one country's economy to another's. Next question, why is blockchain data considered to be relatively safe? Well, that's because a copy of the database or ledger is held by many users, each node on the network, so it's practically impossible to hack and modify the ledger. Finally, why is Bitcoin considered to be pioneering, even though other digital currencies came before it? Well, because it's the first to use blockchain technology, which makes it very secure and eliminates the chance of double spending. I hope you enjoyed this exercise. In this video, I'll discuss how Bitcoin pricing is set. Bitcoin is a digital currency, and like other more traditional currencies, it has a value associated with it, and that value is determined by supply and demand. As the demand for Bitcoins increases, as requests for Bitcoin purchases rise in number, that is, the price rises. As demand decreases, as there are more people with Bitcoins to sell them than there are to purchase them, the price drops. So, just like other currencies and commodities, Bitcoin's value is very much affected by conditions, both internal and external, that drives its worth. Let's talk about Bitcoin supply for a moment. There is a finite amount of Bitcoins. As new buyers make purchase requests, the term is mining, so the coins are mined, new Bitcoins are created. Mining creates new transactions in the Bitcoin ledger, the blockchain. As of October 2016, there were nearly 16 million Bitcoins in circulation, and Bitcoin has a permanent cap of 21 million, so there can never be more than that. So at its current circulation, around 75% of the cap has been consumed. As I just implied, new Bitcoins are created on demand, so if all Bitcoins in circulation are currently owned, new purchases create new Bitcoins, provided the number of Bitcoins never exceeds the cap of 21 million. So it's clear that the limited number of Bitcoins means that demand will drive its price. Think about things that have value, sports memorabilia, comic books, antique furniture, collectibles. Their value is driven by having a limited number. The most valuable comic books, for example, are valuable because they're rare. There are only so many copies out there. If they weren't, then they wouldn't be nearly as valuable because there would be a large supply and more people could purchase them, leading the seller to reduce the price because people have more options. That's a sort of basic analogy, but it does illustrate how value is determined by supply. As new Bitcoins are created, the rate at which they're created tends to decrease because there tends to be a higher degree of trading for existing Bitcoins rather than the purchase of new Bitcoins. The rate at which Bitcoins are created also tends to be predictable because you can analyze the trading data over time, but also because as the number of Bitcoins in circulation increases, it's more likely people will trade for them rather than purchase them, due in large part to the greater supply of existing Bitcoins. More sellers and more availability means greater opportunity for buyers. So what about Bitcoin stability? There's a huge concern in any currency market, and if you know anything about markets, whether they be for currencies, stocks, or commodities, there are internal and external conditions that can have drastic effects on pricing. Highly volatile markets, while tending to offer larger returns, can be very dangerous because the slightest force can spook buyers and sellers. Markets with low-risk, stable environments are safe bet markets that offer lower returns but remain attractive due to their stability. Bitcoin is in a fairly volatile market, and we see that just by looking at how its price changes over time. But it's a relatively small market, which helps stabilize things a bit for the simple reason that the more players lead to greater chance of volatility. Likewise, the limited number of available Bitcoins helps to buffer some of Bitcoin's volatility. Pricing can be affected by many things, though, and some of these are obvious elements that affect any market, like skepticism and fear. Owners, for example, who misread a situation or react suddenly to an event, a Bitcoin hack, for example, tend to panic and dump what they own. When a portion of owners suddenly sell off what they have, it creates uncertainty and drives the price down. Tenuous knowledge, the fact that Bitcoin is still a new concept and people may hesitate to buy or sell because they're not sure of what they know. Bitcoin's relative newness. People have been trading in traditional currencies for hundreds of years, but Bitcoin's not even 10 years old yet. And the adoption of Bitcoin, the amount of people and companies that accept Bitcoin as payment, has a direct effect on the pricing because it speaks directly to acceptance. If, for example, a major website were to announce tomorrow that it no longer accepted Bitcoins, that would likely have a dramatic effect on the value of Bitcoins. Then there's a lack of regulations. Governments and agencies have been scrambling to put rules in place and surround Bitcoin with an environment that keeps it from being abused, say using Bitcoins for illegal transactions or taking advantage of unsuspecting Bitcoin buyers for fraudulent purposes. But it is new, and it's going to take time before Bitcoin catches up in a regulatory sense. That can cause some users to be skittish about Bitcoin. And look, events cause volatility. Hacks of Bitcoin exchanges, and they're somewhat regular in frequency, has an effect on pricing. But it's not just Bitcoin-specific events. The same events that affect other markets can have an effect on Bitcoin. So, for example, a Brexit vote, an election, a housing crisis, an uprising in a country halfway around the world, and so on. Events can have direct and dramatic influence on the value of Bitcoin. And that leads to the stability of Bitcoin pricing and how it's affected by events. Now, these are specific to Bitcoin, but remember that non-Bitcoin related events can have an effect too. Scandals like the Silk Road Marketplace, which was a black market for illegal drugs, have an effect on pricing. Fraud, like when Charlie Shrem was forced to resign from the Bitcoin Foundation because of his involvement in Silk Road, for which he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Scams like the Evolution Marketplace, a darknet market which shut down suddenly, stealing $12 million in bitcoins. And finally, Ponzi schemes like MyCoin and hacking events like Bitfinex all affect pricing, causing panic and uncertainty. So all this sounds a bit gloomy and not very encouraging, but could Bitcoin crash? After all, there's a history of currencies, traditional currencies, that have crashed suddenly and lost all value. The Confederate dollar in the U.S., which became worthless after the North won the U.S. Civil War. The Papiermark in Germany after World War I. The Zimbabwean dollar, which was demonetized in 2015 due to hyperinflation, that saw the creation of a $1 trillion currency note. And the Argentinian peso. All these are examples of currencies that stopped having value for one reason or another. Even recently, the Indian government suddenly canceled 2 high denomination notes, causing a panic among people who held those bills. The move was to combat corruption and counterfeiting, and the rupee is still India's currency, but if you hold any of the canceled notes, they're totally worthless now. And I mentioned hyperinflation. That can be a common element in a currency's demise. Germany after World War I was left crippled by post-war treaties, for example, and people were buying loaves of bread with baskets of money, or so it's been suggested. But while Bitcoin could crash, inflation won't be a factor, probably because its value is linked to hard currencies like the US dollar and euro, but also because it's not a national currency. If it did suffer from inflation, in other words, it would be because currencies like the dollar and euro were subjected to inflation, but there's not a one-to-one correlation between Bitcoin and inflation. And just to pull this all together, there are some factors that could cause Bitcoin to crash. A massive scandal to beat all other scandals, for example. But it seems like Bitcoin has had some pretty big ones and come through just fine, so it would have to be a scandal of epic proportions. A total loss of confidence in Bitcoin, which is artificial in the sense that confidence is all in the mind of the owners and buyers, but it might happen. A failure in technology, which could happen, but the underlying blockchain technology is pretty safe, so it would have to be something on the front end of a Bitcoin site to cause a crash. Or, and this is possible, something comes along to take the place of Bitcoin. There are hundreds of digital currencies out there, none with the cachet of Bitcoin, but you never know. And then just generally external issues that we can't predict. Simply put, you never know. In this video, I'll discuss the Bitcoin community. Bitcoin has grown steadily since its inception, and with it is the size of the community advocating for it. The community itself starts with these two sites, the community portal and the wiki portal. IRC channels include Bitcoin, Bitcoin Dev, Bitcoin OTC, or over-the-counter trading, Bitcoin Market, and Bitcoin mining. There are many forums, and here are a few. Bitcoin Talk Forum, Reddit's Bitcoin community, and Bitcoin Stack Exchange for Q&A. And on social networks, there's the Google Plus Bitcoin community and communities on Twitter and Facebook. The community's been very busy, too, with all sorts of events happening offline. In October 2016, Scaling Bitcoin in Milan, Italy, and Cryptocurrency PubCon in New York City. And in March 2017, the Blockchain Africa Conference in Johannesburg. And there are ongoing meetups for Bitcoin users and developers. There are also several Bitcoin regions and community forums, ranging from Austria to the Philippines to Israel, Poland, and Russia, and there are 45 different community forums held in 31 countries. There's also a tremendous amount of resources for people involved in Bitcoin or planning to become involved, starting with a number of publications, news sites, and blogs. Keep in mind that these are only some of the available resources for Bitcoin enthusiasts, and there are new ones coming online all the time. In this video, I'll explain how to get started in the buying and selling of Bitcoins. So you've decided you want to engage in the buying and selling of Bitcoins. Where do you start? Well, the good news for new users is that they can start buying and selling Bitcoins without understanding the underlying technology. The first step, get a wallet, which is what Bitcoin client software is called. There's a growing number of choices for Bitcoin wallets, regardless of the platform you use. So for PCs, there are currently 10 for Windows, Mac, and Linux computers. For mobile devices, you have 11 choices for Android, iOS, Windows Phone, and BlackBerry. And there are 7 web-based wallets that will run in a browser. There are even hardware-based Bitcoin wallets, which are physical devices that offer more secure features than software-based wallets. Most Bitcoin wallets are free to use, except the hardware-based wallets, which of course have a price of purchase. So what do Bitcoin wallets do? Well, they create and control private keys, enable security display information about the Bitcoin network and display transaction information, and distribute events to peers. You can navigate to this site to compare wallets, and start by selecting mobile, desktop, hardware, or web. And when you select a wallet, a pop-up will provide you with helpful information about the wallet, offering information on how you control your money, how validation is provided, whether the wallet offers complete transparency, whether it represents a vulnerable environment, and how privacy is established. If you see orange text, that indicates a deficiency, and that way you can choose the wallet that's right for you. Let's discuss Bitcoin addresses. Once you've downloaded and installed your new wallet, it will generate a Bitcoin address, which is a location for Bitcoin payments. Addresses can be created by any Bitcoin user with a Bitcoin wallet, and there's no cost to creating an address. Addresses are an ID made up of 26 to 35 alphanumeric characters beginning with a 1 or a 3. And you can and should create new addresses when you need them. Addresses are used only once, and new transactions use new addresses. Users normally don't need to worry about address creation, though, as most wallets create new addresses automatically. Bitcoin transactions between users requires that your address is shared, so when you send a payment or receive one, your address is shared with the other party's wallet. To bring it all home, I want to discuss the basics of Bitcoin, starting with the blockchain, which is a distributed database that contains your balances. It's a shared public ledger, meaning that all transactions, including the ones you make, are in the blockchain, and it's protected by cryptography. Bitcoin transactions use private keys that are transferred between Bitcoin wallets, and they use a specific signature that protects your transactions and guarantees that a payment or purchase comes from a specific user. And mining, the process of buying and selling Bitcoins, is a constant string of transactions that are placed in a queue, in the order that they've been created. Every 10 minutes or so, the blockchain is updated with all the queued transactions, and mining ensures that the chronology of transactions is recorded. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin units. Currencies are typically based on a primary unit, a dollar or euro for example, and then multiplied or subdivided into units because different commodities have different values. A pack of gum might cost 90 cents, for which you'd use a few quarters, a dime, and a nickel to pay. And using different units to comprise a monetary unit is more than convenient, it's a necessity. Bitcoin is no different. We talk in terms of single Bitcoins with the denominator BTC, but because a Bitcoin is worth around $600 and surpassed $1,000 at one point, it's impractical to price things in single Bitcoins, the same way it's impractical to price goods and services in purely integer values, just dollars or yen for example. You need to be able to divvy up Bitcoins so you can actually use them to make purchases. With that in mind, the creators of Bitcoin decided to assign a single Bitcoin as having a value of 10 to the 8th power, or 100 million units. It's really quite an elegant solution because it provides a very high degree of precision over Bitcoin units, and it bucks the common metaphor of integer values that we normally use with hard currency. This was smart because there was no way of knowing exactly how valuable Bitcoin would be, and rather than having hyperinflation scenarios where you were buying a pizza with 1 billion Bitcoin, the total number of Bitcoins in circulation has been capped at 21 million, and a high degree of subunits is favored. The method for subdividing Bitcoins was adopted from the International System of Units, which defines the modern metric system, of which there are 7 basic units listed here. But these aren't the units used by Bitcoin. Let's take a look at how Bitcoin uses the International System of Units. The Bitcoin system of units uses divisions of 10, just like the metric system. 10 is the number of choice because the Arabic numbering system is base 10, and that's what the world uses to count. It's easy to multiply and divide by 10, and if you're familiar with the metric system, you know how easy it is to work with. Examples of common Bitcoin units are the decibitcoin, which is 1/10th, the centibitcoin, 1/100th, the millibitcoin, 1/1000th, and microbitcoins, often referred to as bits, which are worth 1/1,000,000th of a bitcoin. But there are also other systems used to subdivide bitcoins. Tonal Bitcoin uses the tonal numbering system, which is a base 16 system, and it's not new. It dates back to the 1850s and has been used as an alternative to the metric system, the base 10 system. The tonal system provides infinite binary division, and I won't get into the weeds here by trying to explain its intricacies, just to say that people like the tonal system because it provides very granular and precise values of measurement. And there's also the Satoshi system, which is currently the smallest unit of Bitcoin available. It equals 100 millionth of a Bitcoin and was named after the person or persons who invented Bitcoin, known to the world as Satoshi Nakamoto. Satoshis are used by the Bitcoin blockchain, and internally every amount is measured in Satoshis before being displayed in larger units. Here's a chart of the common Bitcoin units. I won't get into describing each, but suffice it to say, if you plan on buying and selling Bitcoins, you should at least familiarize yourself with these units and their abbreviations. Your software wallet will certainly help when dealing with Bitcoins, but the Bitcoin system is different than what you're probably accustomed to, so it's a good idea to know what you're getting into. I will note, however, that the very top of this table is the maximum amount of Bitcoins that will ever be created, approximately 21 million, and then you can use the decimal values underneath to determine how many Bitcoins or sub-Bitcoins each unit is worth. In this video, I'll discuss capital markets and blockchain technology. Blockchain is revolutionary, maybe as revolutionary as the internet, but it's certainly shaking to the core of the financial industry, and it's crucial to their future. They recognize it too because they're going out of their ways to take advantage of blockchain and apply technology to capital markets. While pretty much every player in the financial world is developing or planning to develop some sort of blockchain implementation, there were several early adopters or companies that got the jump on the rest of the industry, and these are a few of those players. As you can see, they're pretty significant players. But why? What are the various de facto innovations that blockchain brings to the table? For starters, blockchain's use of encryption and the novel way it's used to enhance security, and that's extremely important in the financial world. The use of mutual consensus provides verification of transactions across a distributed network, providing an elegant solution to avoiding problems like hacking and double spending. The decentralized nature of blockchain negates the need for third parties usually required to provide consensus or transaction processing, and fewer intermediaries means lower markup and greater profit. The idea of smart contracts is extremely attractive to financial and other companies because not only are they protected from any modification, code can be attached to the blockchain ledger providing special instructions. Perhaps a certain transaction will trigger attached code to execute and perform some sort of meaningful function in the outside world. Blockchain all but guarantees data efficiency, integrity, and universality, and is quick. Near real-time processing and updating is of great interest to organizations that have had to use traditional methods that aren't nearly as expedient. There are numerous technological benefits of blockchain, from real-time data to real-time transactions, transaction efficiency, transparency, fraud prevention, reduced data errors, reduced risk, and dispute resolution. In the blockchain, items that aren't normally given a value in the real world can have value. Things like contracts and invoices can have real value attached to them. And there's a better overall start-to-finish process when working with blockchain, meaning that with its data integrity, lack of intermediaries, non-repudiation, and error-free transaction processing, the overall process is much smoother than traditional practices. So what's in store for the future of blockchain? Well, we're already seeing the future in the sense that it's already starting to happen. The technology is either being used or will be used to create simplified processes, standardized processes, move assets, move ledger transactions, move ownership and asset in real time or near real time, establish shared flat ledgers, reduce transaction costs, reduce client maintenance costs, and customize business rules. In this video, I'll discuss the various problems with blockchain technology. Blockchain is undeniably a game-changing technology, but it's not perfect. It needs work. There's currently no standardization around blockchain technology, and like any technology, without standardization, it's going to flounder a bit in the way it's implemented, and it might get messy. We've seen examples in the recent past where standardization was needed to cement a technology. Image technologies like the Joint Photographic Experts Group, or JPEG, and the Motion Picture Experts Group, MPEG. Web technologies like HTML or JavaScript and related technologies, for example, flourished and grew in popularity and use because they had standardizing bodies that shaped the focus and direction of those technologies. But they encountered their own growing pains, and blockchain is no different in the way it will grow and be shaped, but it needs standardization. It's not currently scalable enough. There's a need to expand its ability to grow into large and complex implementations. To put it bluntly, it needs to be developed further. Maybe Silicon Valley companies will get on board and steer the ship. There's plenty of brain power in the IBMs, Apples, Microsofts, and Googles of the world, so maybe they'll see solutions coming out of the tech giants. And there's still plenty of confusion over how blockchain might be leveraged. After all, it goes way beyond Bitcoin, and we're already seeing examples of novel and innovative blockchain implementations. But much of what can be done with the technology hasn't been conceived yet. Expect to see lots of successes and perhaps lots of failures as people realize the full potential of this technology. And the costs associated with adopting the technology and building the necessary infrastructure may still be too prohibitive for many companies who aren't convinced of blockchain's staying power. This fear is mostly a result of not understanding the potential or the potential implementations, though. So what are the potential hurdles of adopting blockchain? Well, for starters, it's still new, and the fact that companies just aren't convinced that it's safe or usable or practical is a roadblock in itself. Like anything, universal adoption is caused by a chain reaction of adopters, the momentum itself driving new adoption. And it's a simple fact that investor and consumer behavior by nature is volatile, especially when confronted with the new and unknown, something we see all the time with the rapid growth of technology. It isn't surprising that people are cautiously dipping their toes in the water because they don't want to jump in. And let's face it, banks make money by charging fees. So how will they take advantage of blockchain and still be able to satisfy these shareholders? Financial organizations particularly face a lot of challenges when it comes to adopting new technologies. It's not necessarily a priority for them unless they can see a clear benefit. And the financial industry is mired in long-standing tradition and ways of doing things, so they're not known for their innovation. Another hurdle is collaboration. Blockchain technology by nature is collaborative technology, and it shines most brightly in collaborative environments. This, in the short term anyway, may be a problem for industries that simply aren't used to working together. It needs people, industries, organizations, thought leaders, to come together and figure out how blockchain can be used and grown. Again, that's a problem for people not used to working together, but perhaps blockchain will be the glue to make that happen. Its lack of a regulatory environment needs to be addressed. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see a blockchain consortium formed sometime in the near future, similar to the way that the Bitcoin community has exploded. A consortium that will put together the largest organizations and visionaries to put some shape around blockchain and its future. That'll be difficult considering it's open source, but there are plenty of examples of open source technologies that have thrived through collaboration. Think Linux and HTML. Its legislative and legal landscape needs to evolve, with nations recognizing the potential benefits and pitfalls of an unregulated blockchain. And there are so many applications of the blockchain technology that haven't even been conceived yet. This needs to happen too, and it will. Remember, Bitcoin, smart contracts, file-sharing blockchains, commodities blockchains are all happening now, but they're only the beginning. In this video, I'll discuss future opportunities for blockchain. So, what's in store for the future of blockchain? The current use cases are still fairly nascent, even the obvious one, Bitcoin. Same with smart contracts and data storage blockchains. But there are many possible implementations of blockchain already in play. Moody's estimates that there are about 120 blockchain projects already being developed, and that number will grow every day. But real opportunities need champions, the early adopters, pioneers, change agents, and thought leaders. That's how blockchain will expand and evolve. The obvious beginning of blockchain's future growth lies in the way it handles data. That's the big benefit of blockchain. It holds a complete and non-refutable record with the ability to store data that won't change or be susceptible to change. And you can view data properties and metadata on the blockchain without revealing sensitive information, so it has the ability to provide useful information that can still be controlled. But what can be done to enact change? Well, first, focus on the strengths of blockchain. Its distributed ledger, the way it supports mutual consensus, and its compelling security. But you still have to address security concerns that give organizations pause to leap into blockchain. The past hacks and fraud don't represent the future of blockchain, but they are troublesome, and that has to be addressed to help assuage people's fears. We sort of have to stop thinking about blockchain as just money. It's way more than Bitcoin, although Bitcoin can very well be and has been the ambassador of blockchain technology. And the marketplace needs to be educated about the benefits of blockchain. That means consumers, investors, and organizations. And by education, that will come in a couple of forms. First, the ongoing success of use cases like Bitcoin, as well as the new use cases that have been developed or will be developed. But it may benefit everyone if a consortium forms that can be an advocate for blockchain technology, focusing the message and delivering reasons why blockchain is the way of the future. So here are just a few of the targeted uses of blockchain technology, the ones we already know about. And as you can see, there are plenty of them. Everything from regulatory compliance to the Internet of Things to supply chain management to taxes. This list will keep growing. And here are some of the industries that have already identified blockchain for adoption. Financials, the obvious one, along with capital markets, but governments and non-government organizations, energy, healthcare, manufacturing, insurance, real estate, media, they're all industries that are or will be developing blockchain solutions. Finally, here are some of the actual use cases we're seeing, things already being done or created. Currency exchange, cryptocurrency, application development, data content, secure messaging, land registration, home automation, medical records, marketplaces, car leasing, and ride sharing. It's pretty incredible, isn't it? One has to wonder how far this world-changing technology is going to take us. In this video, I'll discuss the blockchain ledger. A ledger is a compendium of transactions, and originally a ledger was a book filled with a series of transactions in the order they were created. Well, today a ledger is an electronic collection of files, but it has the same purpose as a physical ledger. In bookkeeping, a ledger is a place where final business transactions are registered, known appropriately as the final entry. And entries in a ledger are two-way, each transaction having payments in, credits, and payments out, debits. Entries are categorized too, with assets, equity, expense, income, and so on. In blockchain technology, the ledger is a digital entity in the blockchain, and like general ledgers, the blockchain stores information. Transactions are in, information from a source, and out, information to a source. When you make a Bitcoin transaction, for example, that transaction is stored in the ledger. And like ledgers, the blockchain ledger can store detail on transactions, the who, what, where, why, how, and much more. The blockchain ledger is distributed, containing public information, and everyone on the blockchain has a copy of the ledger. And the blockchain ledger is a chain of hashes, numerical codes that verify and guarantee the integrity of data in the blockchain. It's worth noting that since hashes verify data, you cannot change blockchain ledger transactions without changing hashes as well, and that's an important aspect of blockchain's security. This is a basic understanding of how ledgers store transactions, and it starts with the transaction being created. For example, in Bitcoin, a Bitcoin wallet purchases Bitcoins using a private key. And then the transaction is broadcast to the network, in the case of Bitcoin, approximately every 10 minutes. Transactions aren't encrypted at that point because the blockchain ledger needs to see them. And every client has to record and establish ownership of the transaction, in this example, Bitcoins. Then the transaction is validated, and finally it's added to a block in the blockchain ledger. In this video, I'll discuss single, double, and triple entry accounting. Traditionally, there are two main types of accounting, single and double entry. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'm also going to talk about triple entry accounting because we're talking about the blockchain. Now, double entry accounting is the typical method used in modern accounting by businesses, but let's start with single entry accounting, which is usually only applicable to small organizations with simple transactions. For example, a home budget, a checkbook in the old days. Only one entry is made for a transaction, which is why it's called single entry, and it's a positive or negative amount, money in, money out. Usually you'd have two columns, one for income, money in, and one for expenses, money out. And there's only one entry per line, the transaction. Single entry can be used to determine income, but it isn't really capable of creating more complex business reports like assets and liabilities, cash flow, balance sheet, and profit and loss statements. Double entry, as I stated earlier, is the common method for most businesses, from small to large organizations, and the approach is that every transaction must have an in and out, the point being that money going somewhere must actually come from somewhere. In double entry accounting, every account is assigned to two columns, and every transaction is recorded in two places with the item and the opposite result. For example, a credit might be an invoice payment, which credits the cash category, and a debit, like an invoice payment, debits accounts receivable. Double entry tracks assets and liabilities, an important activity, especially for businesses, and it provides a reporting structure which creates trust in the numbers. Triple entry accounting, which is how blockchain works, is really double entry plus one, so it's similar to double entry. And it represents transactions between two parties, the buyer and seller. Transactions have a signature, that's the third party. It validates the transaction and uses cryptography to secure the information. So in Bitcoin, you can think of the third party as the Bitcoin wallet, and you can think of triple entry as having a credit, a debit, and a receipt that contains the transaction information. In this video, I'll discuss local and distributed ledgers. A ledger is a compendium of transactions, and originally ledgers were books containing series of transactions entered in the order that they were created. Ledgers today are electronic collections of files, and they perform the same purpose as a book-based ledger. They're essentially business records of categories like assets, liabilities, credits, and debits, and ledger items can include things like cash, credit, expenses, and tax. Businesses often use multiple ledgers to track assets and transfers, store and monitor ownership, record business activity, and ledgers act as a record of a business itself. Ledger transactions include numerous players: employees, suppliers, clients, professionals like lawyers, accountants, and auditors. And it goes without saying that business ledgers are managed and controlled by a business. It's the responsibility of businesses to maintain ledgers and their integrity. Local ledgers are a single copy that resides in a specific place, and they can be physical or digital. While copies can be made of a local ledger, the prime version, the original, is considered the sole item of record. And an example of a local ledger is an accounting database created by some form of accounting software. And there are a couple of benefits to local ledgers. They are very efficient and they can be updated quickly. And drawbacks of local ledgers include their tendency to be prone to error, the risk of being subject to malicious activity like fraudulent modification, and they're also difficult to recover if data loss occurs. Remember, there's only one legitimate copy, so if it becomes corrupted or filled with incorrect information, it becomes a nightmare to try to bring it back to a pristine form. With distributed ledgers, on the other hand, multiple copies can be distributed to many locations or parties, and that could mean to computers on a network. That's the essence of blockchain's distributed technology. There's no one owner or controller, and as with local ledgers, the integrity of the ledger is imperative, and therefore consensus is imperative. There has to be at least a plurality that reaches an agreement. The obvious example of a distributed ledger is Bitcoin, and the benefits of distributed ledgers include their data integrity, the reduced risk of corruption, and the security that they provide. And there are drawbacks to distributed ledgers. Distribution of the ledger has to maintain consensus, so unlike a local ledger which can be updated quickly, distributed ledgers tend to be updated more slowly, and distributed ledgers are less attractive in real-world trading scenarios because of that. In this video, I'll discuss centralized and decentralized ledgers. What is a centralized ledger? Well, the basic explanation is that it's a collection of transactions that are managed by a solitary player. Think of your bank statement as a centralized ledger. The bank controls it and its contents, that is, which transactions get posted and the credits and debits to the ledger. With a centralized ledger, you can't control when the ledger holder, the bank, decides to modify the ledger. The ledger holder can take money because you have an implicit or explicit understanding, that is your agreement with your bank, that allows them to levy charges like fees and interest. So here's the problem. What if the ledger holder, your bank in this case, isn't acting honorably? Well, the quick answer is that you have no control. The consent is out of your hands because you signed a client agreement with the bank when you opened the account, and arbitrary decisions, whether your consent was implied or explicit, are therefore possible. And this presents a serious risk if the ledger holder has malicious intent. For example, if the ledger holder goes out of business, you have little or no recourse. Good luck getting your money. So is the decentralized, basically the distributed ledger, the solution? With decentralized ledgers, no single party has control, but roles can be assigned. There's no central location for the ledger, and that's the peer-to-peer methodology behind blockchain. With centralized ledgers, ledger updating is universal because the database is distributed out to the nodes, so every single node has its own copy and all copies are in agreement. Bitcoin is the perfect example of the decentralized ledger. There are several compelling benefits to a decentralized ledger. It's open and transparent. Every copy contains every transaction ever recorded. It maintains secure data with practically zero risk of tampering. The data remains intact and free of corruption because there are multiple copies held in multiple nodes. And the decentralized ledger can be distributed just to trusted parties. On the other hand, there are a few drawbacks to the decentralized ledger. The time it takes to update the ledger can be problematic. It's not necessarily in real time, and for transactions that require real-time updating, the decentralized ledger may not be the solution because there are environments where real-time transactions drive prices, like in stock markets. Bitcoin updates approximately every 10 minutes, and that works for Bitcoin, but it may not work for other scenarios. And if the decentralized ledger is open to the public, the trust relationship has to be implied. But what if you have some badly behaved players in the public network? What about people who are there because they want to cause mayhem and line their own pockets? So the question has to be asked, is the decentralized ledger prone to attack? The short answer is yes, because everything that represents an opportunity for illegal gain is going to be a target for malicious attackers. But being prone to attack doesn't mean being susceptible to attack, and that's where the safety and security part comes in with decentralized ledgers like blockchain. It may be an attractive target, but the nature of decentralization means that it will likely remain secure. Now that you've learned the basics of digital currency and blockchain, it's time to put some of that knowledge to work. In this exercise, you'll prepare responses to the following questions about Bitcoin and blockchain. First, what two main criteria establish Bitcoin pricing? What's the common name for Bitcoin clients? What factors could cause Bitcoin to crash? What is 100 millionth of a Bitcoin most commonly called? And what are the benefits of decentralized ledgers? At this point, you can pause this video and perform the exercise. Once you're finished, resume the video and see how I would do it. So let's answer these questions. You may not have answered in exactly the same way, and that's all right. First, what two main criteria establish Bitcoin pricing? Well, the answer is supply and demand. Next, what's the common name for Bitcoin clients? And the answer is wallets. Next, what factors could cause Bitcoin to crash? And there are several answers, but typically something like a massive scandal, complete loss of confidence, technological failures, something that would take Bitcoin's place, or external and unpredictable issues. Next question. What is 100 millionth of a Bitcoin most commonly called? Well, the name for that is the Satoshi. Next, what are the benefits of decentralized ledgers? And there are several, and the answers are they're open and transparent. Every copy contains all the transactions since the beginning of time. They maintain secure data. Data remains intact and free of corruption. And it can be distributed only to trusted parties. I hope you found this exercise helpful. In this video, I'll introduce you to cryptocurrencies. Alternative forms of currency aren't a novel concept. In fact, the process of sharing currency alternatives is quite ancient, usually in the form of a mutually agreed upon credit, that is, both parties agree what the form of payment should be. It's not legal tender. Legal tender is state established and must be accepted as payment, but when independent parties come to some sort of agreement, only the parties have to agree. So credit could be extended in gold, silver, or some other commodity, a credit note, or some sort of bartering agreement. I'll put my silo of grain up against your 50 cattle, for example, that kind of thing. And so currency as an alternative form is and has been essentially any currency that's not channeled through a financial institution. Cryptocurrency is a digital form of currency whose exchange is facilitated electronically and secured by encryption. The exchange itself, the body issuing the currency, is responsible for the creation of new currency units, sort of like the way that nations print new money. The exchange creates new currency at a rate determined by its own system. And in the case of Bitcoin, the amount of currency that can be created is capped. It will never go beyond 21 million Bitcoins. And that's not unlike printed currency in the real world, where nations determine how much currency they want to produce. It's finite. There aren't unlimited amounts of cash being printed. And although it's not the first cryptocurrency, Bitcoin was the first decentralized cryptocurrency, meaning that there wasn't a central authority controlling its issue and pricing. Earlier forms of digital currency include eCash, Hashcash, BitGold, Anonymous eCash, and RPOW, short for Reusable Proof of Work. These are predecessors of Bitcoin, which hit the scene in 2009. Today, there are more than 700 forms of cryptocurrency, but it should be noted that fewer than 10 have a market cap of more than $10 million. These are a few of the notable ones, but 700 is a big number. One has to wonder how or whether they'll survive. But to understand the power that Satoshi Nakamoto's technology has had on modern cryptocurrencies, remember that every modern decentralized cryptocurrency is based on the same technology, the blockchain. And Bitcoin was the first, so you may come across the term altcoins, which refers to the many types of cryptocurrency all based on the Bitcoin system. In this video, I'll introduce you to cryptography. Cryptography can be a daunting concept, so let's start with some terminology that might help demystify things a bit. Cryptography itself is the science of securing information through encryption, making information impossible to be seen by unauthorized eyes. Encryption means the act of converting plain text into ciphertext being encrypted information. In the graphic on the right, what you're seeing is plain text and some of that text's actual encrypted data next to it. And decryption is the reverse process of converting ciphertext back into understandable plain text. Cryptographic algorithms, known as ciphers, are the actual computer code, the software that encrypts and decrypts information. The term adversary is often used in cryptography to refer to a third party that seeks to crack encryption for malicious reasons. Cryptoanalysis is the actual activity of hacking encrypted data. Cryptology, not to be confused with cryptography, is the name for the mathematical discipline focused on cryptography and cryptoanalysis. And a hash value is a small data set used to check the integrity of encrypted data. Cryptography is comprised of several disciplines, the science of cryptography itself, as well as cryptology and cryptoanalysis, and it includes computer science, data and information science, mathematics, electrical engineering, and probably many other disciplines. It's far-sweeping. No matter the discipline, the primary goal, the ultimate goal of cryptography is to ensure that information can't be viewed by just anyone. And while cryptography often incites images of spy novels and Hollywood movies with a nefarious and secretive element of intrigue, suggesting that it's a perfect technology, that simply isn't the case. It hasn't always been perfect, nor is it now. It's improved, and it's very difficult to break encryption, but that normally comes down to computing power, which changes dramatically over time. There are some important aspects of cryptography, the driving forces behind encryption technology, and why there are people who dedicate their lives to the technology. These are the tenets of cryptography: the need for confidentiality, data integrity and data safety, the ability to accurately authenticate data, and non-repudiation, the idea that a party cannot repudiate what's contained within the data. Examples of common uses of encryption in the real world include password-protected data, digital signatures, secure web browsing through SSL and TLS, chip cards, and wireless encryption. And listed here are the common wireless encryption methods. In this video, I'll provide a brief history of cryptography. Early and admittedly rudimentary examples of cryptography involved the practice of converting messages using a prearranged system, the idea being that only the sender and receiver were aware of the system being used. This, of course, required alphabets, so after-written language was established. The most common examples were the reordering of letters and substituting letters, and you can see two examples of this in the graphics on the right. The first is a reordering cipher where the alphabet used a shift method. So in this example, the alphabet has been shifted 3 characters to the right. X is A, Y is B, Z is C, A is D, and so on. So the word bad would be written out as EDG. Very rudimentary, but useful enough if you needed to hide a message from someone who didn't know the specific shift amount. Then, in the next example, the substitution cipher, which is a little more secure, you create a map of letters that map to other letters, and this is totally arbitrary. So here, A becomes P, P becomes X, C, M, and so on. As I said, a little more secure, but only to the casual observer, and with a little work, it isn't terribly difficult to crack either of these methods. Hieroglyphs was one of the earliest forms of cryptography, and they could be quite effective because people creating the messages weren't limited to a finite alphabet, instead using symbols to represent something. Even handwriting was used as an early form of cipher because it required the reader to understand cursive and therefore require some sort of education, which wasn't always available unless you were of a certain class, but more so because you could substitute words for other words, again assuming the reader was privy to the code, and it would seem like an innocuous message to someone not in the know. Nevertheless, while all these methods were used in early ciphering, they're all relatively easy to crack using methods like simply looking for patterns and using plain old common sense. Later cryptographic methods became more sophisticated, and in the 1400s, polyalphabetic encryption used different substitution sets for different portions of messages, mixing it up so there wasn't a clear pattern throughout a message. Mechanical devices like disks and cylinders were created to aid in the encoding and decoding of messages. Then there's Steganography, which is a method for hiding messages, but it's more than just encryption. Steganography is a method of hiding information in other information, with the intent of making the hidden message's existence unknown. You may be familiar with forms of steganography where there's hidden information in drawings, paintings, or digital images, for example. And think about digital watermarks, whose patterns are encoded in images without the viewer's express knowledge that they're there. But here's the perpetual challenge of cryptography. As new encryption methods were created, new methods of cracking encryption were developed. It's been an ongoing battle. Charles Babbage, the father of computing, famously worked over his career to develop cipher cracking techniques. And in the 20th century, several major events changed the cryptography landscape in significant ways. World War I and World War II, for example, created an imperative need to encrypt messages, and several notable scientists were involved in the creation of new techniques. The discipline of mathematics was used as a way of creating more sophisticated encryption methods, and prior to digital computers, mechanical devices were developed, notably the Enigma machine, which was developed at the end of World War I, as a way of protecting information through ciphers. And then there was the work of Alan Turing, mathematician and computer scientist, whose work on cryptanalysis in the Second World War is considered to have fueled many information technology movements, including cryptography. And then, of course, digital computers changed everything all over again, as data could now be stored as binary digits, and that shaped the future direction of modern cryptography. In this video, I'll provide a basic understanding of how encryption works. The two most common methods of encryption are public key, known as asymmetric, and private key, known as symmetric encryption. All encryption begins with plain text, readable content, and to encrypt anything you need to use a password. The stronger the better. The more complex the password, the more difficult it will be to crack. And there's often confusion over the terms key and password, both used in the encryption process. A key is not equal to a password, although passwords can be keys. Keys are measured by the number of bits they use, and basically the more bits used, the stronger the encryption, and the more difficult it is to crack. Modern methods of cracking use something known as brute force, which is the use of sheer computer processing power to cycle through all the possible combinations. So generally speaking, the more complex the key and password, the more exponentially difficult it is to crack the encryption. There are different types of encryption, beginning with the earliest example using 40-bit encryption. 40 bits gives you 2 to the 40 possible keys, or more than 1 trillion possibilities. And while that may sound like a lot, modern computers can brute force crack a 40-bit encryption in a matter of hours or days, so that's no good. DES, short for Data Encryption Standard, uses 56-bit encryption, or 2 to the 56 possible keys, or 72 quadrillion possibilities. It was developed in the early 1970s, and in 1998, a DES encrypted file was cracked in 55 hours. Again, not very useful if you absolutely need to protect data. AES, or Advanced Encryption Standard, also known as Ringdale encryption, uses 3 different key lengths, 128, 192, or 256 bits, with a block size of 128 bits. This is the current encryption standard, and it was adopted by the US government in 2002. Regardless of the encryption method used, the process of encryption is basically the same. You start with plain text, which is your input text, the information you want encrypted. And note that while I talk about plain text, that really what we're talking about is any digital information. So it could be a text file or it could be a binary file like a software application. You choose an encryption method, let's say AES, and the number of bits for the key, for example, 256. You choose a password, and the encryption algorithm converts the plain text into ciphertext using either a private or public key. And the encryption algorithm converts the plain text into ciphertext using either a private or public key. And to decrypt, the process acts in reverse using the key and password provided. In this video, I'll discuss hash functions. The simplest way to explain a hash function is that it maps data from any size to a specific size. So what it does is use a specific hash value to represent the exact data, no matter how long that data is. The graphic on the right shows what the hash value for the word input looks like, and input is a short word, but it still generates that hash. Hash values are thought to be impossible to parse or reverse, which is why they're so important. You can't take a hash value and figure out what the text contains. It's an encrypted value that simply represents the text. So looking at the hash value on the right, there's no way to know that it represents the word input. And it could just as easily represent the entire collected works of Shakespeare and you wouldn't know it. Hash values are commonly used as a checksum value, meaning that you can download a file and compare the hash value of the downloaded file with the hash value provided by the site you downloaded it from, and tell if they're the same. If the hash values are the same, then you've downloaded the file correctly. And keep in mind that hash value in its main intention is not a checksum, but it's used commonly as a checksum. And the practical purpose for this is in verifying data integrity. If the hash values are the same, then you've got an exact copy of the file. And I'll demonstrate this in a moment, but even minor changes to a file will change the hash value. Now for some terminology. MD5 hashes use 128-bit encryption, and SHA-1 hashes use 160-bit encryption. They always produce the same result, so if you create a hash value from a file today and then go back and create a hash value a month from now, the resulting hash will be exactly the same as long as the file hasn't changed. Now, if you look at the graphic on the right, you can see the MD5 hash value for the text, "The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dogs." But look at the hash value for the second example. It's completely different. Notice what's different about the text each hash represents? Well, in the top example, a capital T is used at the beginning of the sentence. In the bottom example, I use a lowercase t, and that's the only difference between these two pieces of text. So this should give you an idea of how very specific hash values are because they change so dramatically for the sake of a single character. Hash functions are easy to produce. If you want to try it out, you can search for any number of sites that will generate hash values. Enter some text and press a button, and you'll have your hash value. It's extremely unlikely that two different files will produce the same hash value, mathematically speaking. It's practically impossible. And hashes are useful in all sorts of ways. In data management, they're used to quickly identify duplicate tables and/or records. This is far more practical than doing a one-to-one comparison of the data in databases because that can be very processor intensive. But hashes are quickly generated and quickly compared. And in cryptography, hash functions are used to validate encrypted data for integrity and anti-tampering. So what are some of the practical uses of hash values? Well, they protect and validate the integrity of data. I've already discussed that. And as I said, hash tables are used to identify duplicates in databases. They can identify similar data, and they're even used in DNA analysis. They're used with digital signatures, and they can be used for detecting and correcting errors. They're used for digital fingerprinting, and in Bitcoin, hashes are used to verify transactions. In this video, I'll discuss symmetric and asymmetric encryption. Symmetric cryptography is commonly known as private key encryption, and it uses the same encryption key and decryption key. So both sides must have the same key. Because the key needs to be shared, symmetric cryptography is considered to be a weak method, or at least a less secure method of sharing encrypted data. Asymmetric cryptography, known as public key encryption, is considered to be a better method because it uses two different keys, a private or secret key and a public key. The keys are generated by the same algorithm, with the private key generating a digital signature and the public key validating the digital signature. Data is encrypted by the public key, but it can only be decrypted by the private key, so it's very important to keep the private key secure. Authentication is done with the hash function generated during encryption, and asymmetric cryptography plays an important role in Bitcoin. In this video, I'll discuss digital signatures. Digital signatures are used to provide authentication. For example, a document or a Bitcoin transaction. They're used to verify the user, and they're irrefutable. They cannot be challenged for their integrity. They ensure that data hasn't changed during transmission, and data generated on the sender and seller side is done using a private key, with the signature verified on the receiver side using a public key. Here's why digital signatures are important. They ensure non-repudiation. That is, a sender can't deny that he or she sent it, and a receiver can't deny that he or she received it. They provide authentication, validating that the user created it, and they guarantee integrity of the data, ensuring that it hasn't changed at some point between when it was created and when it was received. Digital signatures offer important security, reducing the risk of tampering, fraud, and forgery. In this video, I'll introduce you to digital certificates. Digital certificates are public key certificates that verify a public key, thus establishing ownership and trust. Certificates contain important information, things like the identity of the owner, the key information, and a digital signature. Often, you'll obtain a digital certificate from a certificate authority, or CA, and that's an organization that issues secure certificates on behalf of other organizations. Certificates use the Public Key Infrastructure, or PKI, which is an established set of policies governing certificates and their security. For example, PKI includes expiry dates for certificates, just one method of ensuring that someone eligible to access a resource today doesn't have ongoing access. And the certificate signer can be the owner of the key or trusted agents, those who have been explicitly trusted by the certificate authority. If the signer is the key holder, a certificate is said to be self-signed. Digital certificates are often used to create secure transactions between a sender and receiver, for example, someone surfing the web and a website. They use secure socket layer technology, which is encrypted when transferring certificates, and certificates are used in websites, data transfers, and secure transactions, the kind of transactions you'd find in blockchain technology. As I said, they often contain expiry dates and other security mechanisms, for example, certificate revocation information. And other examples of how digital certificates are used include secure network connections on a LAN, virtual private networks, remote desktop connections, messaging applications, and even blockchain. In fact, MIT is working on a digital certificates project where certificates can be stored in the blockchain, and they've already released the code for this. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin addresses. Bitcoin clients, better known as wallets, are the software applications that allow you to buy and sell Bitcoins. Their primary functions include the creation and control of private keys, the provision of security, the display of Bitcoin network information and transaction information, and to distribute events to peers on the blockchain. A Bitcoin address is a location where Bitcoin payments are made, and they can be created by any Bitcoin user using a Bitcoin wallet. It might help to think of a Bitcoin address as an email address because the paradigm is the same. I give you an address and you send Bitcoins to that address. An important difference between email and Bitcoin addresses, however, is that Bitcoin addresses are only used once. They're a single-use token. So let's talk about the Bitcoin address format. A Bitcoin address contains 26 to 35 alphanumeric characters, and these aren't hexadecimal values, so you have the full 26-character alphabet to choose from. It always begins with either a 1 or a 3, and this represents the destination for Bitcoin payments. There's no cost to create addresses. And most wallets will create them automatically when you send or request a payment. For example, in many, probably most Bitcoin wallets, you choose to create a new address for a transaction. You can also obtain a Bitcoin address at a Bitcoin exchange or online wallet service. And as I mentioned before, there are two address formats. P2PKH addresses begin with a 1. Newer P2SH addresses begin with a 3, and you can see examples of both address types here. Now, let's address some specifics of Bitcoin addresses. They can be created offline, meaning you don't need an internet connection to create an address. They're case sensitive, so not only do you have access to the 26 alphabetic characters, you actually have 52 possible characters to choose from, which means an astronomical amount of possible addresses. They're precise. A Bitcoin address won't be duplicated, and each one is unique. Most wallets provide some sort of authentication of addresses, specifically in the form of a signature, and provide methods to validate addresses. In addition, addresses can have multiple private keys, allowing you to securely perform transactions with different parties at the same time. There are some important considerations when working with addresses. First, addresses are used to receive payments only, not send them, meaning that if you send a payment to someone else, you're sending to their address. They aren't meant to be reused. Although it is possible, it's not a practice you should ever undertake. Addresses aren't accounts. They're not wallets, and they don't carry a balance. Essentially, they're one-off alphanumeric values used to receive payments one time only. In this video, I'll discuss the Bitcoin network. So let's discuss the Bitcoin network. First, it's a peer-to-peer network, and if you don't know anything about P2P, the idea is that you have multiple peers, computers and other devices, all connected and all performing somewhat equally. In Bitcoin, every peer holds and maintains a copy of the blockchain ledger. The Bitcoin network uses cryptographic protocols to secure and protect information being transmitted, and the name for Bitcoin software clients is wallet. Bitcoins are sent as secure digitally signed transactions, and transactions are stored in a blockchain. When consensus, the act of reaching mutual agreement from a majority of peers, is arrived at, new transactions are stored in the blockchain as a new block, and this activity is known as mining. The Bitcoin protocol itself was defined in 2008 in a white paper published under the name Satoshi Nakamoto, and we don't know if that was a single person or a group of persons. And the Bitcoin software is open source, so it's free to anyone for development activities. This is generally a good thing, but it does present possible concerns. In the open source world, you usually see an environment of collaboration where the community works to improve core technology, but it also runs the risk of having people who aren't so collaborative take the technology in ways that it shouldn't go. That's not a major concern, however, because errant or malicious changes to the code don't affect the core technology, which is protected by a group of individuals who have to agree upon changes before they are implemented into the master code, if you will. As for network infrastructure, the Bitcoin network, as I mentioned earlier, is P2P, and that means it's made up of all Bitcoin clients connected to the network. There's no formal structure to the network. As devices connect and disconnect from it, the structure of the network makeup changes. For example, right now there could be 1 million or 10 million or 100 million wallets connected to the Bitcoin network. And that number is constantly changing as people log in or log off, and that's the nature of peer-to-peer. And wallet holders represent a group of multiple devices, desktops, laptops, tablets, phones, and even hardware wallets that would be connected to the network. And as I just mentioned, this means that the Bitcoin network is dynamic as devices join and leave. And wallets load and verify transactions, that is blocks, when they reconnect to the network. So a wallet could be offline for a couple of days, and as soon as it reconnects, it will receive the most up-to-date version of the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, let's turn to transactions. All Bitcoin transactions are signed transactions, providing secure blocks that have cryptographically signed information that can't be repudiated. An owner of Bitcoins is listed on the blockchain as the owner of the transaction, which is effectively ownership of the Bitcoins. And when an owner transfers Bitcoins to other parties, the change in ownership of those Bitcoins is recorded as a transaction on the blockchain. So, in essence, an owner signs over the Bitcoins in much the same way you might sign over ownership of a deed or automobile. The new owner becomes listed on the blockchain as the owner of the transferred bitcoins, and the blockchain contains a complete record of all bitcoins, all owners, and all transactions. But there are a few notable elements to discuss on Bitcoin transactions. First, individual bitcoins aren't recorded separately. After all, it just wouldn't be practical considering the sheer number of ongoing transactions. So therefore, Bitcoin transactions on the blockchain can contain several bitcoins or parts thereof, all with different owners. And transactions are combinations of inputs and outputs, with inputs representing payments, and that could be a single large amount of bitcoins or multiple small amounts of bitcoins, and outputs representing Bitcoin payments and the change, if there's any, from transactions. And keep in mind that there can be transaction fees when buying and selling bitcoins, and that's how many exchanges or sites make money, by taking a small portion of the transaction as an intermediary. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin mining. In traditional monetary systems, governments that want to create new currency simply mint or print new money. But it's not as simple as that. There have to be controls in place to ensure that there isn't a saturation of currency in the marketplace. But generally speaking, if you wanted to create new money, you could. But Bitcoin isn't traditional, and so we talk about mining, which is the process of resolving Bitcoin transactions, computations to validate Bitcoin transactions. This ensures blockchain security and stability by preventing tampering and creating a secure record, and the process of mining requires a complete record of all transactions. So you've probably guessed that Bitcoin mining needs a blockchain as that record. The Bitcoin ledger is a blockchain, which is a public ledger. The activity of mining adds transactions to the Bitcoin ledger as Bitcoins are sold. And the ledger or blockchain is the chain of blocks, which are groups of transactions. They're validated before they become a blockchain, and the Bitcoin blockchain keeps track of everything, including ownership of Bitcoins. And the blockchain prevents double spending by updating the ledger and reaching consensus. Here's how mining works. When a new group of transactions is created, it's added to the blockchain, and this is accomplished through consensus, the act of getting a majority of nodes on the Bitcoin network to reach an agreement. The Bitcoin blockchain isn't updated in real time, rather it's updated about every 10 minutes, and this update process is where the mining process occurs. When groups of transactions are converted into a hash, and you can see a sample hash in the graphic on the right, the hash is stored in the blockchain along with the group of transactions. And because a hash exactly represents the contents of a group of transactions, the transactions are non-refutable, meaning the slightest change to that group, the new block, would drastically change the hash value. And this creates an aura of trust around Bitcoin transactions. Every block gets a hash, so you can run a new hash on a block and compare it with the included hash to ensure that nothing has changed. This is the non-refutable part, but it goes deeper. Every hash is created from the hash of the prior block, and the group hash is created from the blocks in a group of transactions. Additionally, it uses the hash from the last transaction, and while that may be a little much to digest in one bite, the net effect is that it's virtually impossible to change the blockchain. It cannot be corrupted or altered. The mining process doesn't actually create Bitcoins, transactions, or update the blockchain, but rather mining is used to solve problems so that the blockchain can be updated. It involves the work done to solve math problems, increasingly complex problems that require a lot of processing horsepower. And this is where competition comes in. Generally, the more processing power you throw at a math problem, the higher the likelihood that you'll solve it first. So miners invest a lot of money in hardware and power generation to solve these problems because there's a reward for solving the problem, so transactions can be added to the blockchain. And the reward is that miners receive Bitcoin as a transaction fee, so there's an obvious benefit to mining. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin improvement proposals. Bitcoin is an open source technology, meaning that the source code for Bitcoin is freely available to access and modify. But open source means much more than that. At its heart, open source usually refers to a collaborative environment where community members work together to improve upon the existing code. Bitcoin's structure is fairly open-ended, though. There's no formal agreements on what it should look like, and so it's natural to assume that different people will have different ideas about what should be done with it. But because the community works together to develop the technology, the community also has to come to agreement about what should be done to modify or improve the technology. Enter Bitcoin Improvement Proposals, or BIPs, which are documents that suggest design improvements for Bitcoin. And that could be modified functionality, new features, or even better or new information on Bitcoin. There are three kinds of BIPs: standard track, informational, or process BIPs. BIP 0001, put forward in 2011, for example, was the first BIP, and it describes a BIP and the workflow that should be used for BIPs. That's available for anyone who wants to review it, and there's a full list of BIPs which to date number more than 150 and can be reviewed online. And there's a full list of BIPs which to date number more than 150 and can be reviewed online at this site. In addition, there's the Hard Fork Wish List, HW, which is a collection of information about proposed changes to Bitcoin. But unlike BIPs, HWs would force a hard split of the blockchain, meaning that everyone would need to upgrade their clients to access the blockchain. HWs aren't backward compatible, and old software won't accept new transactions, which would be treated as invalid blocks by the older clients. So HWs are really a wish list, and as you can imagine, they would have to be significantly beneficial to Bitcoin to be adopted into the source code. You can find more information on hard fork wish lists at this site. On the other hand, soft fork wish lists, or SWs, which are also proposed changes to Bitcoin, force a soft split of the blockchain, unlike hard fork wish lists. They require a consensus of miners in order to be adopted, and this consensus would reject blocks that were normally considered valid. These transactions would be considered by old software as new transactions that were payable to anybody, but they wouldn't be redeemed and would be rejected by new clients and miners. Like HWs, SWs are a wish list, and you can find out more about them at this site. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin and blockchain explorers. Blockchain explorers are just what the name suggests, places to explore blockchain activity, and there are plenty of sites, for example, these two. You can explore blockchain transactions in real time and review things like block height, which refers to the number of blocks that come before the new block, the age of a block, the number of transactions in a block, the Bitcoin cent, the identity of the miner, and the size of the block. So let's take a look. So here's one of those sites, and it's just showing us the activity that's going on right now in real time with Bitcoin. And you can see we have the latest blocks here with the various categories. And down here we can actually see the transactions as they're occurring. So it's a really useful way of being able to see what's going on with Bitcoin or blockchain, depending on what environment you're looking at. Now this one is another explorer that allows you to explore the Bitcoin blockchain updates and review things like block height, when it was created, how many transactions there were, the block fee, the commission that was paid, the size of the block, and days destroyed, which is a term referring to the usage of Bitcoins over time. For example, the same Bitcoin might be spent over and over again many times in the space of a day, so it's not really a useful method to talk about trading volume when the same Bitcoins are being reused over and over again. Days destroyed simply adds weight to the older Bitcoins that haven't been traded recently. And there are other explorers. For example, this is a Litecoin explorer, and there are explorers for Ethereum, Monero, and even aggregate sites that allow you to review the blockchain of different technologies, like this one that gives you access to blockchain information on Bitcoin testnet, Litecoin, Dogecoin, Block Cipher, and testnet. Additionally, you can explore different charts for blockchain, like this site, which allows you to review all sorts of different statistics about blockchain, like Bitcoins in circulation, market cap, trading volume, the blockchain size, and much, much more. In this video, I'll discuss buying Bitcoins. Like any other commodity, there are recommended ways of purchasing Bitcoin, and it all starts with the technology you use to buy them. You always start with researching and obtaining a wallet, and research is bolded here because I cannot stress enough the importance of researching the various wallet options before you commit. Now, if you don't like a wallet, you can always choose another one, but there are different considerations for wallets. And you should start here. Look at the various wallet types and what they offer. Not all wallets are created equal, and likewise, not all exchanges and sellers should be blindly trusted. You need to understand what their internal controls are for protecting your money and check out their reputation. See what other users are saying about them. While it would be nice for everyone to act honorably, the onus is upon the purchaser to perform due diligence. Finally, you need to decide how you're going to pay for Bitcoins. Now, there are various payment methods. PayPal doesn't offer a way to directly purchase Bitcoins, but the Virtual World Exchange will let you purchase Second Life Lindens, SLLs, and convert them to Bitcoins. Not really an attractive option due to the higher transaction fees, and frankly, it's clunky. You can purchase Bitcoins with a credit card, and various platforms like Verwox, Qubits, and CoinMama accept all major credit cards. And some exchanges accept multiple foreign currencies, bank transfers, and/or cash, money orders, bank drafts, and other common forms of payment. Here's what you need to know when you're purchasing Bitcoins. There are several options for storing Bitcoins on your PC, your smartphone or tablet, in a software wallet, or through a web-based service, through a hardware device, which costs extra, and through other secure methods, for example, a secure offline service, sort of like a stockbroker. But none of these methods is entirely without problems. First, data corruption is a real concern. You should back up your wallet regularly. There's the issue of online security. How secure is your connection, and how secure is your provider's software and safety mechanisms? You have to take that into account. And what authentication methods are exchanges using? Do they force you to create a secure password? Is that the only method they use to keep you safe? The best bet is to go with a secure provider with multi-factor authentication, for example, a text message to your phone as a backup to a password. Now, I've already said this, but it's important enough to repeat. Choose your exchange and your wallet carefully. Not all exchanges are created equal, and they all want your business. So how desperately do they want it? And not all wallets are created equal, and again, they all want your business. And remember that exchanges and wallets store your digital and hard currency, just like banks do, and they all require information from you, and that's to validate your identity, which is a good thing. Also remember that most exchanges are regulated by the laws of their countries, so you'll want to know where they're located and how they're regulated. It's not a bad idea to go with one in the same country you live in, if that's possible. And you can choose your exchange from a list of the various exchanges, which you can see on this site, or you can find exchanges through a web search. In this video, I'll discuss selling Bitcoins. So how do you sell Bitcoins? Well, for starters, you should know that it's a little easier to purchase them than sell them, and the process will differ depending on the software wallet you're using and the exchange. Your options for selling Bitcoins include online at an ATM and even in person, although that seems a bit defeatist when talking about a digital currency. Regardless, that's your choice. Generally speaking, you have to complete the following tasks to sell. First, open an account using a wallet. Purchase some Bitcoins, go to the deposit or sell section in your wallet, then select an address, which would already be provided by the party you're sending to, and then send the payment. Now, it sounds pretty straightforward, right? But you should also consider whether to withdraw your cash from the exchange. It's unlikely you'll be making any interest off of the money when it's sitting in their coffers, so you should consider how you want to handle your cash. So let's talk about selling Bitcoins through direct trade, the most common method. It can be direct between two parties with a middleman like an exchange. You must be a registered seller and verified by the exchange. And to sell, you would post offers for how many Bitcoins and how much you're willing to sell them for. Once you're connected with the buyer, it's a direct transaction between you and the buyer, and the middleman, the website, may take a transaction fee. The main benefit here is that the money is transferred between you and the other party, rather than having an intermediary handling it. You can also sell through an online Bitcoin exchange, and to do that, you'd research exchanges, choose one, and register with it. You'll need to verify your identity so they're confident that you are who you say you are, and the key point of exchanges is that they withhold the money of both parties. They're the middlemen. So to place a sell order, you'd list the amount of Bitcoins you want to sell, the amount of Bitcoins you're selling, and the price you're willing to accept. There are fees for using exchanges, and you'll probably want to withdraw your money to a bank as it's not really beneficial or desirable to leave your money with the exchange unless you plan to perform regular and ongoing buying and selling. Again, an exchange isn't going to pay interest on your money. There are also peer-to-peer marketplaces, which are relatively new to Bitcoin. Sites like Purse and Broker, for example, will act as a matchmaker for people with similar needs. They'll provide the connection between you and someone else, they'll provide the software, and they'll provide escrow to ensure that both parties have been paid before transactions are completed. For example, let's say that party A wants to make a purchase from a site that doesn't accept Bitcoins, and that party B has a credit with that site and wants to purchase Bitcoins. The connection is made, the price is agreed upon, and once party A receives the purchase price in the form of the site credits, let's say, the P2P site releases escrow and party B receives its Bitcoins. In this video, I'll discuss unspent transaction outputs. Unspent transaction outputs, or UTXOs, are an important facet of working with Bitcoin. First, let's tackle what an output is. It's the amount sent to a Bitcoin address. And UTXOs can be spent as inputs in a new transaction. Nodes that prevent transaction validation use UTXOs to establish the validity of transactions. And inputs for a transaction are valid only if they're in the UTXO database. If a transaction isn't in the UTXO database, then it's either an attempt at double spending or an attempt at spending non-existent Bitcoins. And in either event, the transaction wouldn't be valid. Now, that may seem like a lot of meaningless jargon, but essentially what we're talking about is change. Think of UTXOs as change, as in change from a purchase that you made. UTXOs are used by future transactions, so the change sits in your wallet as small bits of Bitcoins waiting to be applied to new transactions. The UTXO database is required to validate all the transactions. And you can think of UTXOs as currency. So in the graphic on the right, at the very top you see portions of Bitcoins, 0.5, 0.02, and 2. These are all unspent units of Bitcoins that were left over after you purchased something else. Think about giving someone $1.50 for something that cost $1.35. You get back a dime and a nickel, the change. Each UTXO has a signature containing a specific amount that can be applied to new transactions, and whatever's left over will be added back to the owner's list of UTXOs. Individual or multiple UTXOs can be used for transactions, so whatever it takes to cover the new transaction. If you had a dime and a nickel in your pocket from the previous example and you purchased something that cost $1.15, you use the dime and the nickel in addition to $1. You can see that in the graphic where there's a unit of 0.5 Bitcoins in the UTXO database belonging to you. And that becomes an input for a new transaction which goes to Stan. But you're only paying Stan 0.3 Bitcoins, so the output from that transaction would be 0.2, which goes back into the UTXO database to be used at a later date. Now that you've learned the basics of digital currency and blockchain, it's time to put some of that knowledge to work. In this exercise, you'll prepare responses to the following questions about Bitcoin transactions and mining. How many characters are in Bitcoin addresses? What is mining? What are the four main options for storing Bitcoins? What are UTXOs? And what is a majority attack? At this point, you can pause this video and perform the exercise. Once you're finished, resume the video and see how I would do it. Resume the video and see how I would answer these questions. So let's address these questions. I've captured most, but not all of the possible responses, so if you don't see your answers here, it's all right. First, how many characters are in Bitcoin addresses? Well, the answer is Bitcoin addresses can have between 26 to 35 alphanumeric characters. Next, what is mining? Well, mining is the activity of validating transactions by processing hashes and adding valid blocks to the blockchain. Next, what are the four main options for storing Bitcoins? So the answer is on your device as a software wallet, through a web-based service, through a hardware device, or through another secure method, like a secure offline service. Next, what are UTXOs? UTXO stands for Unspent Transaction Units, and they're leftover portions of Bitcoins. You can think of it as change that can be used against future transactions. Next, what is a majority attack? Well, a majority attack, which is also known as a 51% attack, is when a node on the blockchain has processing or hashing control over at least 51% of hashed transactions. I hope you found this exercise helpful. In this video, I'll discuss anonymity and Bitcoin. Anonymity is difficult in this day and age, but we have mechanisms that can be used to protect our identity. When you're dealing in financial matters, though, it's even more important to protect your identity. So the question arises, just how anonymous can you be in the Bitcoin world? Well, it's not a very satisfying answer if anonymity is everything to you. Here's the problem. The Bitcoin ledger is a public ledger. It contains addresses and user information, but remember, it's numbers and not names. Your email address or phone number won't show up in the Bitcoin ledger. But every Bitcoin transaction is logged publicly, and if someone with nefarious intent could determine from the ledger just who a transaction belonged to, it would be possible to build a history of transactions and addresses. And if you spent any time with the Bitcoin Explorer, you know that addresses are very easy to find. And that simple fact alone is the best reason for using addresses only once. And if Bitcoin transactions don't contain sender information, how could your information be revealed? Well, here's a very plausible example. You purchase Bitcoins from someone you don't know, and to do that, you have to send them an address that belongs to you. Tracking that address, the unknown entity on the other side could watch what you do with those Bitcoins. Perhaps they have a website that's set up to ensnare you, and when you spend the Bitcoins, they could use the identity you used when they sold you the coins to match you with the owner that made the purchase. The takeaway here, as with anything and everything, always be mindful of who you do business with. So here are some tips that can help you remain anonymous as much as possible. First, always generate a new address. That's the cardinal rule of working with Bitcoin. Wallets will do it for you, and it doesn't cost anything. Remember that the Bitcoins you own have addresses attached to them. So you want to try to avoid one-to-one transactions. For example, if you buy 2 Bitcoins, don't suddenly make a purchase with the same 2 Bitcoins. Browser-based wallets tend to be more anonymous. They can help conceal IP addresses, and the Bitcoins are stored with the provider, not in your system. So that's one possible option. And you could also anonymize your Bitcoins by creating a new browser-based account and transferring all your Bitcoins to that account. So that's another possible option. Ultimately, however, just research and know your web provider before you undertake this kind of action, should anonymity be a major concern for you. In this video, I'll discuss volatility and Bitcoin. In finance, volatility is a measurement over a period of time that defines the variation between trading prices. Plainly speaking, volatility compares prices and how frequently and how much they change. Volatility is a reliable indicator of stability and safety, as in safety of a particular investment. But when you consider volatility, what's more reliable? An indicator of past performance or current performance, that is current as in the recent past, like the last month or quarter, for example. Well, historical volatility suggests a stock or some sort of commodity from a past date. For example, volatility of Bitcoin since its inception in 2009, and how it's performed since then, maybe between 2009 and 2015. Whereas current volatility, as is implied by the recent past and how it's performing now, is eminently more useful because you're not investing in Bitcoins in 2009. You're investing in Bitcoins today. Nevertheless, past performance is still an important indicator if you want to analyze trends and identify events that cause the price of Bitcoins to change. All markets are subject to volatility. It's a fact of markets. But some stocks and markets are more volatile than others. For example, blue chip stocks are historically stable stocks for high-performing companies that have continued to make money for investors over a prolonged period of time, the IBMs and GMs of the world. And when you review a chart for a stock, you can see the volatility as illustrated in these two graphs. A sloping line with moderate peaks and dips, like the top chart, suggests no or low volatility, as it characterizes gradual changes over time. And erratic lines, like the lower chart, suggest high volatility, characterized by sudden and frequent changes over short periods of time, and often a trend that's sustained over time. For investors, volatility can be an important measurement of risk versus return. Generally speaking, low risk equates to low returns, and high risk suggests possible high returns, but with a caveat. The lower the risk, the more stable your investment is, and the lower the chances that you lose money, while the opposite is true of high-risk ventures. They promise high returns if successful, but that's a big if, so buyer beware. There are many factors that affect or influence volatility. For example, volatility is driven by investor confidence. If confidence levels are high, then investors hold on to what they own and purchase more. If sudden confidence drops, investors sell off what they have and the price drops because people are willing to accept less to protect their investments. Regulations play a part in volatility as they define how a company must conduct itself according to the laws of the countries it operates in. And scandals are always a big one for influencing volatility, causing people to dump stocks, and we've seen a few scandals with Bitcoin. Market corrections are natural events when the market as a whole corrects itself, whether the stocks were underpriced or overpriced, just bringing everything into line. And while they're not entirely volatility events, they can also cause shareholders to panic and sell off what they have, creating an artificial volatility, if you will. Perception is a big one too. If someone perceives something negative or positive, no matter how true that perception is, it can cause sudden shifts in buying and selling behavior. Misunderstandings too. False reports or rumors that prove to be untrue later can affect things now. And then global or local events, things that have nothing to do with the company or commodity, but nevertheless cause investors to panic. And then there's fear of the unknown, a huge one because investors don't know how to react, so they react on instinct. Finally, there's volatility itself, which is a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. If investors start to recognize a trend that suggests volatility, it's further incentive for them to get out before they lose everything, and that can have a snowball effect. Now, all the factors from the previous slide can affect any market, including Bitcoins, and then we have some more that probably belong on the previous list, but a few that can be devastating for a relatively new commodity like Bitcoin. They include negative press, the perception of value, what's it really worth? Technological issues, problem with wallets, websites, or exchanges. Major scandals like Mt. Gox, for example, are an influencer. And pending events, for example, Bitcoin halved in 2016, meaning that miners were suddenly making a half of what they were making before. The US dollar, which so many currencies are dependent on, can affect Bitcoin, and taxation issues, for example. As new regulations and laws are established in countries, they could negatively or positively impact Bitcoin's price. And misunderstandings are a factor too, things like the technology behind buying and selling Bitcoins, the rationale for buying or selling them, again, the unknown. And then there's misunderstanding of the potential, which could drive prices up or down rapidly and suddenly. So how volatile is Bitcoin really? Well, if you're interested in seeing Bitcoin's performance over time, you can check out this website, where Bitcoin's volatility is tracked in US dollars. It measures volatility over 30 and 60-day windows, and provides currently historical volatility, meaning you'll see Bitcoin's volatility as it relates to all time, but it doesn't really give you a good sense of how volatile Bitcoin is right now. At some point, the site probably will be using implied current volatility, which is far more useful, because you can measure Bitcoin's volatility in the here and now, which is important if you want to buy or sell Bitcoins. The current estimates on a 30-day window suggest that Bitcoin's volatility runs about 2%. And on a 60-day window as about 1.8%. And the site even gives you the opportunity to compare Bitcoin's volatility with other commodities and currencies. For example, the volatility of gold is running around 1.2%. At some point, it probably will be implied current volatility, which is far more useful because you can measure Bitcoin's volatility in the here and now, which is important if you want to buy or sell Bitcoins. In this video, I'll discuss unconfirmed transactions. The Bitcoin blockchain is updated approximately every 10 minutes, and new transactions go through a series of steps. A transaction is created, so someone buys some Bitcoins. New transactions are added to a pool of transactions known as the mempool, and then consensus is reached by the current nodes connected to the network. Miners who verify Bitcoin transactions using hashes verify and then add transactions as the next block. Now, the mining process is a holding area where transactions aren't confirmed until their hashes have been solved. And it's important to note that different nodes have different memory for storing transactions, as well as different processing power. For example, a single desktop computer can't really realistically participate in the mining process because it simply doesn't have the computational power to meet the needs of mining thousands of transactions. And every node has its own group of pending transactions, and they're not all the same transactions. As I said, Bitcoin's miners process transactions. The transactions are unconfirmed until they're mined. And this is the consensus part. Transactions need to be confirmed by miners to be added to the Bitcoin blockchain. Miners get paid for this work using a recommended fee. Some transactions have little or no fees, while some transactions have higher fees. But miners get paid more for the higher fee transactions they process. And that begs the question, are small transactions being ignored? If you navigate to this site, you can review the current number of unconfirmed transactions, which is updated in real time. As I'm speaking, there are more than 30,000 unconfirmed transactions, and that number fluctuates up and down regularly, so you may see more or less if you navigate to the site. Here's the problem, though. Transactions are getting stuck for 10 or more hours, maybe much longer, and we're seeing the average number of unconfirmed transactions rise. So if transactions are stuck, what happens? Well, nothing. The transaction is in the ether until someone mines it, and again, this could be for hours or longer. The problem is the mempool, which is a bottleneck. Again, the mempool is the place where unconfirmed transactions wait to be mined. In June 2016, unconfirmed transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain reached more than 40,000, an all-time record, and the Bitcoin blockchain average block size reached 960 kilobytes, and that's about every 10 minutes. Now, if a node's mempool size nears its maximum capacity, a minimal fee threshold is established, and transactions whose fee per kilobyte is lower than the threshold are quite simply ignored, and they're removed from a node's mempool. Not the entire network's mempool, mind you, just the node mining that transaction. And when a new block is mined and applied, the node removes all the transactions it mined and added to the blockchain from its mempool. That mining node may end up receiving those transactions it removed earlier due to the block size constraint. Now, this is all important because the Bitcoin blockchain block size is 1 megabyte, and it's been suggested that 1 megabyte under current activity is simply too small. There are many people who agree. There have been proposals to increase the block size to 2 megabytes or more, but that's caused fear that Bitcoin will centralize, or to say it another way, stop being decentralized. Here's why that's a concern. Nodes with less bandwidth and processing power may leave the network. Now, conventional wisdom says that Bitcoin can process about 7 transactions per second, but reality is that the Bitcoin network can only process around 3 transactions per second. So combined with a growing number of long wait times for confirmation, that's a major problem for financial institutions that need far more in the way of transaction processing speed. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin's irreversibility. Bitcoin transactions, once added to the blockchain ledger, are final. That is, Bitcoin transactions are irreversible. It's no different than a bank, more or less, in the way that when a transaction, like a purchase, is confirmed and recorded, it's done. In the Bitcoin blockchain, transactions are mined, reach consensus, and then added to the blockchain. In other words, this is the validation and the transaction is final, and once validated, the transaction is done, irreversible. But there are scenarios where you can get your money back once a Bitcoin transaction has been validated. First and foremost, it helps to have some sort of trust relationship with the person you paid. If it's a one-off purchase, that may not be the case, but let's pretend that you purchased a brand new gizmo for your kitchen and 5 minutes later have a change of heart. It obviously hasn't shipped yet, so if your vendor is trustworthy and happy to provide refunds, maybe he or she will agree to issue a refund. And that's your only recourse once the transaction has been added to the blockchain. You can only request a refund from the payee. So you would contact the recipient, and if the recipient says, yes, I'll issue you a refund, you would request a new transaction to receive the funds, generate a new address for the receipt of the Bitcoins you just spent, and the person would submit a payment back to you. Now, you may not get everything back. Every person is different, and there may be a transaction fee. On the other hand, what if the recipient says no? Well, the short, sweet answer is that you have no recourse. The ownership of the Bitcoins you sent was transferred to him or her when the block was added to the blockchain, so it's really all about trust and who you deal with, not unlike in the real world. In this video, I'll discuss the Bitcoin mining process. So let's talk about mining. Bitcoin mining uses the Hashcash proof-of-work process. It requires a service string, a nonce, and that's just a cryptography term for a number used only once, and a counter. Now, don't get too concerned about the technical here. The idea is to understand how the information drives the mining process. The service string gets embedded in the block header, remember the block being on the blockchain, and it contains some information, the version, the hash from the prior block. This is called the hash prev block. It also contains the root hash known as the hash Merkle root, which contains all the transactions on the block. and it contains the time and the difficulty, which is a value used by the miner during the mining process. I'll get to that in a minute. The block body contains the transactions being mined, and it's hashed through the Merkle root. The block body is hashed indirectly. And this is all very efficient because it doesn't matter how many transactions there are in the block, it's just as quick no matter what. It's also very secure because the hash value is based on one of the user's addresses, and it's very unlikely that there will be any duplication. And with every miner working with different blocks, they're not all exactly the same. It means that there's almost no chance of hash duplication, practically zero. So this is where the mining process becomes really interesting because in Bitcoin or blockchain mining, we talk about winning. It's a contest in a very real sense because different miners are all trying to solve the same problem at the same time, and every miner has the same chance using this process of winning as the other miners, or hashes, because it's the final hash on the block that's used to validate all the information on that block. I know that's a lot to digest, and probably doesn't even make a lot of sense, but it's a watered-down version of the actual technology, so bear with me here. I want to talk about difficulty because mining by design is meant to be very difficult, but it's extremely easy to verify because you're not verifying all the transactions or comparing blocks. You're only comparing the hashes of a block, and that value on the graphic on the right is an example of what a hash might look like. Hashes are groups of data described in a shorter value, and if one single character in a block is different, a B instead of an A or a 2 instead of a 1, the hash value changes dramatically. Hashes are encrypted, with Bitcoin using an encryption technology called double SHA-256, which is 256-bit encryption. That makes hashes extremely secure and practically impossible to change. So in mining, transactions are added to a block, a 256-bit hash value like the one on the right is generated from the block, and if there are sufficient zeros at the beginning of a hash, mining is achieved. This speaks to difficulty. You don't see a lot of zeros in the hash value on the screen, but as the need to process transactions increases, so too does the difficulty. The Bitcoin algorithm sets the required number of zeros at the beginning of the hash. It changes all the time, and the more zeros, the more difficult the problem is to solve. By enforcing the need for a certain number of zeros in the hash, the problem becomes computationally more difficult. Nevertheless, once a block has been successfully mined, it's distributed to the network for consensus, and the hash value is a unique identifier for the block. You see, mining is an intentionally repetitive process. Hashes are frequently rejected, and so the mining process starts over and the block must be modified. A new hash value for the block is created and then sent back to the Bitcoin network for consensus. This happens over and over again, billions of times, and approximately every 10 minutes, a hash is accepted. Consensus is achieved and the block is added to the Bitcoin blockchain. Then the process starts all over again. In this video, I'll discuss mining pools and centralization. In Bitcoin blockchain processing, mining pools refer to groups that provide computer processing power to solve the blockchain problem and add transactions to the blockchain. There are lots of pools, and miners pool together to provide processing power. You can review a list of them at this site. The information you'll see includes all sorts of information about each pool, including location, the size of the pool, which is subjective, it's just a small, medium, large type rating, transaction fees and other fees, whether the pool has a forum and a website, and so on. Again, you can check out this site to find out what these all mean and all about current mining pools. Mining Bitcoins pays, and it can pay well. Here you can see all sorts of different rewards paid to mining pools in the form of Bitcoins, and these are the various ways that miners can get paid. PPS, pay per share, and DGM, the double geometric method, are the two most common, and each is just a different way of measuring how much a miner makes based on the number of Bitcoins they process. Now, there are issues with pools. For example, versioning can be an issue. Some pools, for example, are still using Bitcoin Core 0.9.5, which is an earlier version, but Bitcoin Core 0.10.2 and up have implemented measures to prevent distributed denial of service attacks. And some pools have been mining on top of blocks before they validate the blocks while they're using 0.9.5. As a result, at least $50,000 were lost during the 2015 fork of Bitcoin. And we know now that transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain are taking longer to mine, with as many as 30,000 or more unconfirmed transactions sitting in limbo for hours or days. This is probably because miners are ignoring smaller transactions because they offer little or no reward, and instead turning their processing power to more lucrative transactions. Keep in mind that transactions still have to be validated by miners no matter the size, but it's taking much longer now than ever before. This is a significant problem because Bitcoin and the blockchain technology it's built on are by design and intention meant to be a decentralized technology. That means no central authority, no one player calling the shots. And consensus is determined in a community setting, while everybody has a copy of the blockchain ledger. So here's where things get very concerning. In July 2014, mining pool Gash.io controlled more than 51% of the Bitcoin hash rate. In other words, it was processing more than 50% of the blockchain. And that put a scare into the Bitcoin community, which put on a renewed push for enforcing decentralization. And you might ask, what's wrong with centralization? Well, for starters, it's entirely contrary to blockchain's design. Blockchain by design is decentralized. It's a key aspect of its security. Blockchain maintains an open and free system where everyone has a copy of the ledger. And like anything else, too much power may corrupt the system. Think of it this way. Bitcoin was meant to improve upon traditional fiat currency systems, but if it becomes centralized, it becomes what it seeks to enhance. If any one entity, that is, pool, controls too much hashing power, it can begin to set the rules. For example, it could allow double spending, the arbitrary cancellation of transactions, or just simply change the rules. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin's security. The Bitcoin blockchain is secure. We know that, and it's not in dispute. Blockchain is an extremely well-built system. But Bitcoin is more than the blockchain. It's software wallets, Bitcoin exchanges, websites, and mining pools. These are not the Bitcoin blockchain, but they do use it to process and store transactions. And Bitcoin has had its fair share of hacks too, again, not necessarily due to the blockchain, but we've seen some significant ones like Mt. Gox, Inputs.io, Silk Road, and others. So let's talk about wallet security. Wallets are software, plain and simple, and not all software is created equal. Keep in mind that wallets don't store bitcoins, and local storage, that is, where you do store your bitcoins, relies on your system's security. How's your firewall and antivirus software? How's your malware protection? The safety of your bitcoins also relies on the wallet's software security and hardware failures. If your hard drive dies, you've lost your bitcoins without a backup. And if you choose online storage for your bitcoins, remember that you have to know the legitimacy of your vendor, what security mechanisms they have in place, and what kind of malicious activity they might be subject to. So with that being said, there are a couple of ways you can protect your bitcoins if you have a lot of them and really need to keep them safe. You can print them out, or you could use a hardware wallet. There's always the issue of double spending, the idea that someone could spend a Bitcoin and then before the transaction was added to the blockchain, spend that same Bitcoin on something else. It's theoretically possible, probable even. For example, a pool with significant hashing power, not even 51%, could allow it. A malicious user could submit multiple transactions to the network all at once and hope the back-end software was fooled, and could even mine a block without sending it to the network and spend the coins again before submitting that block. Now, this is highly unlikely due to the sheer amount of processing power required to enact double spending, but that's today, and we don't know what the processing power will look like in the future. As for mining and security, the big fear, the one that's keeping a lot of Bitcoin people up at night, is the 51% attack, also known as the majority attack. Someone controlling the majority of transaction processing, hashing, would effectively have control of the blockchain and could conceivably change transactions or reject them outright. And yes, allow double spending. We've already seen a scenario in 2016 where a mining pool did have control of 51%. So does that mean it's time to rewrite the rules for Bitcoin? But the 51% attack isn't the only threat. An attack could be undertaken at a lower rate. It's just that 51% guarantees success. In this video, I'll introduce you to Bitcoin hardware. A hardware wallet is a small device or a smart card that contains private and public keys. It stores private keys offline on the hardware itself and provides secure offline signing. Hardware wallets are far more secure than software wallets because the keys are on hard-coded protected circuitry and they're immune to viruses. Using hardware wallets, bitcoins can be spent directly. There are plenty of benefits to hardware wallets. Private keys can't be retrieved from the device, and they're immune to viruses and other software-related threats. They're mostly open source, which means it's easy if you know what you're doing to verify the device's safety. There are a few drawbacks as well. You have to pay for them, and they're not that expensive, so that's okay, ranging from under $100 to several $100s. And here are a few examples of hardware wallets. Each has its own features and form factor. For example, the graphics here are representative of the different options, from a smart card hardware wallet to one on a USB drive to a dedicated device with a digital display. In this video, I'll discuss blockchain experimentality. Bitcoin technology, along with blockchain, has plenty of room for growth, and we're seeing all sorts of activity as people experiment with the technology and develop new ways to leverage it. For example, MIT is conducting the Digital Currency Initiative to increase awareness in digital currencies, but also to create a research environment for policy and standards. The idea here is that the technology can be far-reaching, but it really starts with economists. And MIT's focusing on potential applications, and that means also not necessarily the currency itself. Besides MIT, a possible track for Bitcoin research is the 1 megabyte block limit, which is creating increasing concern because Bitcoin has run out of space, and transactions can't be accommodated anymore in a 10-minute window, which is creating significant division and undue competition in the Bitcoin community. In 2016, the Central Bank of Netherlands announced an ambitious project to work on financial market infrastructures, or FMI. This is important because financial markets are experiencing increased pressure from hackers. While you may not hear about them, it's safe to say that they're happening all the time. The bank's idea is to build a financial system on a blockchain, making it far more difficult to hack because operations would be distributed among nodes. And an attacker would have to have control of 51% of the blockchain nodes to hack it. This is very interesting, and I'm keen to see how they make out with this. Nodes can be distributed anywhere, effectively hiding them from hackers. And in October 2016, a blockchain experiment was conducted between the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and Wells Fargo Bank of the United States to transport 88 bales of cotton, around $35,000, and I assume in Australian dollars, from Australia to Houston, a 7,000-mile trip. The idea was to use blockchain and smart contracts to track the shipment, with ports scanning bales and updating the information to a smart contract on a blockchain. Upon completion of the transaction, the ownership of the shipment was transferred and payment was released. All the parties involved used the same contracts on the blockchain, and by using the blockchain, they could prevent tampering and, in a secure environment, validate the transactions. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin's social impact. I saw this quote from Wences Casares, a well-known entrepreneur and Bitcoin advocate, and it occurred to me how accurate it is. Looking at the pointing finger rather than what's being pointed at, it makes me question whether we've even begun to realize the full impact of Bitcoin and blockchain technology. And the answer, for me anyway, has to be a resounding no. I think we're still looking at the pointing finger. I think the social impact of Bitcoin and blockchain will be tremendous, but let's start with some low-hanging fruit. Will Bitcoin eventually supplant fiat money, the money we've used for centuries? Well, probably not, but the economic implications are tremendous. Think about this: access to banking. Many of us take banking for granted. We run down the street to our neighborhood branch, sign a few documents, and we have an account. But there are places in the world where people cannot get bank accounts. With Bitcoin, however, you can transfer money to anyone, anywhere, and most importantly, there's no intermediary, no middlemen taking their cut. Yes, there are the miners, but they're not really middlemen, they're just people who are taking a small fee to process transactions. Bitcoin could also mean access to credit for people who can't get it from the bank. And think about charities and fighting poverty. You can transfer money anywhere, even to nations with oppressive regimes where people couldn't get access to a bank or a Western Union. Furthermore, a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin can potentially resist the high inflation that we see in other traditional currencies, like in Argentina and Zimbabwe, for example. Bitcoin and blockchain are already game changers, but they offer truly unique opportunities. For example, real-world measurable data on economics, new technologies for trust and transactions, IPOs that occur without the need for a bank. It can play in game theory, which has implications for everything from economics to political science to psychology. And it may be used in economic governance, economic policy, and even to create mock currencies for simulating economic conditions. It's not a stretch to think that it will be used in behavioral research to better understand currency markets. And crowdfunding would be free of fees. and charitable contributions would be cheaper, either with lower or no fees. In this video, I tackle the question, is Bitcoin finished? Now, this may seem contentious, and I don't want to discourage anyone from getting involved in Bitcoin or its technologies. So it's important to first state that blockchain isn't going away, nor are digital currencies finished. But in January of 2016, Mike Hearn, a former Google engineer and well-known contributor to Bitcoin technology, wrote a blog post entitled The Resolution of the Bitcoin Experiment. In it, he revealed that he was leaving the Bitcoin world, and he sold all his Bitcoins. Bitcoin is an experiment, he wrote, and as such, it can fail. Hearn went further than that, though. He stated unequivocally that he thinks Bitcoin has failed, that fundamentals are broken, and that the community has failed. So what's going on here? Has Bitcoin failed? Well, the short answer is not yet. But according to Hearn, and this is a quote, what was meant to be a new decentralized form of money that lacks systemically important institutions and too big to fail has become something even worse, a system completely controlled by just a handful of people. The Bitcoin network is on the verge of technological collapse, he wrote, and built-in mechanisms to prevent collapse have failed. Therefore, he feels there's no reason to look at Bitcoin any differently than traditional monetary systems. Mr. Hearn felt that there is a problem with the leadership inside the Bitcoin community. So let's assume for a moment that what he's saying is legitimate. How has it failed? First, as Hearn pointed out, and as we're now seeing, the blockchain is full. The 1 megabyte hash limit has already created a bottleneck, and the 51% threshold threatens to centralize Bitcoin, making a 51% attack a possibility. By the way, all of this is true. We saw it in 2016. This has all happened. Hearn points out that when a network runs out of capacity, it gets unreliable, being more prone to hacks, that nobody knows what's going on, presumably within the Bitcoin developer community. Why has the capacity limit not been raised, he asks, and why are they not allowing it to grow? Now, this all sounds very dire, and I'm not really here to editorialize on Bitcoin's existential crisis or whether it even has one. I'm just stating facts. Hearn is very well known in the Bitcoin community, has had direct involvement in the writing of Bitcoin core software, and he was an ardent Bitcoin advocate at one point. So if there is even a smidgen of truth in his words, then we should pay attention and ask what's in store for the future of Bitcoin. Hearn wrote in his post that the death spiral begins and that users with unconfirmed transactions and long, that is 7 or more hour wait periods, will eventually look for greener pastures. And he could be right. Developers are at odds with each other, and developers are at odds with miners. Will the 51% attack happen? And if it does, is Bitcoin done? No one really knows, so the only real takeaway here is that the blockchain is safe. It's not going anywhere. And there are more than 700 types of cryptocurrencies in circulation today. Whether or not Bitcoin stays on top of the mountain, those other currencies are also based on blockchain technology. So if Bitcoin does fail, it will be a valuable proof of concept lesson that the others can take to heart to avoid similar issues. Now, we hope that Bitcoin doesn't fail and that it continues to thrive. And perhaps this is just a natural occurrence of growing pains in something so new and revolutionary. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future and pay attention to how Bitcoin thrives and survives. In this video, I'll discuss the purpose of Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin mining is the process of verifying transactions, adding blocks to the blockchain, and creating new Bitcoins when necessary. Essentially, miners validate hashes, which are cryptographic values generated from the contents of the transactions. This is known as solving a problem because the hashing activity is computationally difficult and becomes more difficult based on the amount of mining nodes on the network. And it is a competition, with the miners competing for roughly the same transactions. The miner that finishes first adds their block to the blockchain and gets rewarded for finishing first. So who can mine? Well, anyone with the right hardware. There's a value to the mining process, and incentives are provided to miners to ensure that there are miners out there throwing processing power at the Bitcoin hashing process. These incentives may include transaction fees paid by the person who created a transaction and the creation of new Bitcoins, a miner's main reward for providing processing power. And with every new transaction added to the blockchain, whatever miner solved the problem is rewarded with new Bitcoins. This reward is cut in half every 210,000 blocks in a process known as halving. And this is how new Bitcoins are created. The Bitcoin reward, that is the amount of Bitcoins given to miners, is in new Bitcoins that are created when blocks are added. And the reward changes over time, again in the halving process that occurs every 210,000 blocks. This halving occurs approximately every 4 years. So in 2009, when Bitcoin launched, the reward was 50 Bitcoins for successfully mining a block. In 2012, that reward dropped to 25 Bitcoins. And in 2016, the reward was 12.5 Bitcoins. The halving process will continue, and new Bitcoins will continue to be produced until the Bitcoin maximum limit of 21 million is reached. By the end of 2016, there were more than 16 million Bitcoins in circulation, so it's safe to say that the limit will be reached sooner than later. In this video, I'll discuss mining Bitcoins. Bitcoin mining is the process of solving a problem, known as hashing because the miner processes hashes, to complete transactions and add them to the blockchain. The winner, that is the miner that solves the problem first, gets rewarded, first with transaction fees, and also with new Bitcoins. The reason that miners get rewarded is due to the sheer amount of work or processing power required to solve the hashes is extremely processor intensive, considering that there are hundreds of thousands of transactions being processed each day. Mining requires a great deal of computing power, not the kind of processing power you would find in the average desktop computer. To generate a block can be hours. So let's talk about proof of work. There's a difficulty to solving the hashing problem because hashes have to be validated, and every transaction in a block has a hash. The concept of difficulty is intentional in blockchain processing to make transaction processing computationally difficult and easy to verify, though, because you're not processing the entire set of transactions, just the cryptographic hash attached to them. Hash targets create the difficulty. These are expectations for hashes that are routinely set by the blockchain network. And the reason difficulty is necessary is that it discourages malicious activity like distributed denial of service attacks and spam. But because hashing is so processor intensive, it costs money to process the information. You need some serious computing power. The difficulty is routinely adjusted about every 2 weeks by the network. Pooled mining is when multiple miners contribute to the mining process. The reason that pooled mining is attractive is because miners can combine their hardware resources and spread out the processing power. They work collaboratively to solve problems and generate new blocks, and block rewards are divided among the miners, based on how much processing power they provided to solve the problem. This is tremendously beneficial for smaller miners that can't afford expensive hardware, so they team up to add to the mining process. In this video, I'll discuss mining and processing. In the early days of Bitcoin, that is around 2009 when it was founded, mining was primarily performed by desktop computers, and that's simply because Bitcoin was new and there weren't many transactions to speak of. Even today, mining can be performed with your average desktop computer, but it's simply not practical because you wouldn't be mining many blocks, if any, and you certainly wouldn't make much money. And difficulty, the assigned complexity of problems, is adjusted every 2016 blocks. That's about every 2 weeks. And on the Bitcoin network, the blockchain, the more computational power that's available, the greater the difficulty is. It's increased by the network and mining becomes more difficult. Why, you might ask? Because the more complex the problem, the more secure the solution. It's harder for attackers to work their malicious ways. And it works in reverse too. The less processing power on the blockchain, the less difficult problems become to solve. Because your average CPU just isn't powerful enough to tackle the problem, GPUs, graphical processing units like the ones you find on video accelerator cards, became a popular hardware choice for miners because they're far more powerful than CPUs. Hardware is extremely important in mining. In addition to GPUs, modern miners have turned to application-specific integrated circuits, or ASICs, which have been around since the early 1980s, but ASICs were introduced in 2012 specifically for Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin mining is measured in hash rate, and mining power measured in hashes per second. So here you can see the various hash rates, the highest being a petahash, which is a quadrillion hashes per second. And mining requires great efficiency. The hardware used by miners consume a great deal of electricity, so efficiency is important. The price for mining specific hardware? Well, the price for a low-end ASIC will run in the $100 range, and high-end ASICs will run you $20,000 or more. They're all dedicated units, specifically designed for mining Bitcoins. So they're not general-purpose computers, and their processing power is measured in hashes per second. So generally speaking, the higher the number of hashes per second, the better the unit. Other mining equipment you'll want to consider if you plan on getting into the mining business include high-end power supply units and cooling technology, because computer processing generates a lot of heat. There are several companies in the business of making mining hardware, including these three. And if you want to test the waters before committing to serious mining, there are USB-based miners that offer a good way to learn as a hobby, but not to make money. Again, you need some serious power if you want to get into the business of Bitcoin mining. In this video, I'll discuss types of Bitcoin wallets. There are several types of Bitcoin wallets to choose from. You have what are called cold and hot wallets. So cold wallets are offline or disconnected from the internet, and hot wallets are internet connected. Cold wallets are the most secure type because they're not connected to the internet and therefore not subject to hacking. And these are most useful when you're dealing with large amounts of Bitcoins or simply storing Bitcoins. Hot wallets are therefore less secure because they are connected, and they're advisable when you're making ongoing purchases and require frequent access. Wallets can be broken down into several main types. There are desktop wallets, which are software-based and suitable for desktop and laptop computers. They can be online or offline, and they're available for all three desktop OSs, Windows, OS X, and Linux Unix. Mobile wallets are also software-based and are available for mobile devices, usually phones and tablets. They're available for the four main platforms, Android, iOS, BlackBerry, and Windows Phone. And one benefit of mobile wallets is that they can scan QR codes, which is very useful for the next type, paper wallets. Paper wallets are Bitcoins printed on paper, similar to the graphic displayed here. There are sites that generate paper Bitcoins, for example, blockchain.info, where you can convert a digital Bitcoin into paper that you store as you would any other paper document. Next are web wallets, which, as the name indicates, are web-based, so accessed using a browser. They're online only, offered by third parties, and different web wallets offer different features that you should research first if you plan on choosing a web wallet. Bitcoin clients are also software, and the name is a bit confusing because a wallet is a client, strictly speaking, but when you hear the term Bitcoin client, it usually means the original wallets that constitute the core Bitcoin network, and clients have access to all transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain. Finally, hardware wallets are small and extremely secure, useful if you plan on purchasing a lot of Bitcoins and want to keep them safe because hardware wallets are virtually hack-proof. They're not terribly expensive, usually running around $100 US, and they come in several forms, from plug-in devices to smart cards, USB drives, or customized devices that can be carried with you. In this video, I'll discuss deterministic wallets. Regular Bitcoin wallets create addresses and private keys when needed, and these keys are random, but recovery after some sort of disaster like hardware failure is impossible unless you've backed up your Bitcoins. Deterministic wallets, on the other hand, create data using a specific algorithm that's based on a single seed value, a passphrase. More than that, they can also generate a master public key. The master public key holder can see the balance in a deterministic wallet, but can't use the contents without the private key. And they offer better security. There are two types of deterministic wallets. Type 1 generate addresses but don't allow for a master public key, and Type 2 are hierarchical with 12-character passphrase. Now, unlike early wallets which made backups invalid at around 100 addresses, deterministic wallets can create an unlimited number of addresses. And you can use an easy-to-remember passphrase that's 12 characters, and that passphrase, the seed, generates addresses for you. The wallets contain a single master private key that determines future public keys in a predictable fashion, so it's not random. And they're secure, easy to back up, and easily transferable. In this video, I'll discuss securing your Bitcoin wallets. Choosing a Bitcoin wallet is an awesome task that requires some forethought because security with your money should always be considered. First, remember that not all software is created equal, so you should try to assess what people are saying about specific wallets in your decision-making process. And remember that wallets don't store bitcoins themselves, rather relying on a public key that's used to receive bitcoins and a private key that verifies ownership of the bitcoins. But you can use local or offline storage, keeping in mind that you should have a secure system with a good firewall, antivirus software, and so on, and a wallet that offers good security. Again, not all software is created equal. If you choose to store your bitcoins online, research vendors and find a legitimate one. I'm not suggesting that any of them are illegitimate, but in any scenario where you plan on entrusting your money to someone, you want to know who they are and what their reputation is. And ensure that the online software they're providing is secure, using encrypted tunneling technology like SSL and TLS and so on. You can also use a hardware wallet, which is very secure and not terribly expensive. Or you could print out your bitcoins, which means they're stored on paper, literally. Also, always beware of hardware failure with your computer or whatever device you're using. Hard drives have a life expectancy, and if you're not regularly backing up your bitcoins to another secure device, you run the risk of losing them. Now, here are a few tips for keeping your bitcoins safe. First, there are online bitcoin services that store your bitcoins online, and there have been instances of security breaches, same with bitcoin exchanges. Remember that having security in place and receiving guarantees simply aren't sufficient. If an online service gets hacked and your bitcoins are stolen, how do you know that the service has the money to make things right? Exchanges have gone bankrupt in such scenarios. And I can't stress this enough. Use multi-factor authentication. A username and password simply aren't enough. Find a service that has backup authentications like text message, email, and so on. Also, unless you have a very good reason for doing so, don't keep your money in an exchange or online service. You can keep small amounts there for purchases and so on, but these services aren't banks and they won't pay you interest. And as with any software, keep your wallet software regularly updated, along with your system software, firewall, antivirus definitions, and so on. And this should go without saying, but pick a strong password. Keep it safe. Treat it like your money's on the line, which it is. But you should also ensure that it can be accessed by someone else just in case something happens. Because without it, you can't access your bitcoins. Opt for multi-factor authentication in addition to your password. And always store the majority of your funds offline. For example, paper wallets. Back up your wallet regularly. And consider using a multi-signature wallet, which requires multiple keys to access your bitcoins. There are several available. In this video, I'll discuss passphrase encrypted wallets. BIP 0038, the Bitcoin Improvement Proposal number 38, defines a method for encrypting a private key, and it's used for paper wallets, backups, offline storage, and long-term storage. The idea behind BIP 38 is that if your wallet is compromised, the balance will be safe, unless, of course, your passphrase can be figured out. The downside of BIP 38 is that if you forget your passphrase, you lose your money forever. So here are some tips for choosing a BIP 38 passphrase, and this goes without saying, but don't use password 12345677, a significant date, and so on. It seems really obvious to say that, but time and time again, it's been proven that people use lazy passwords and they're easy to crack. Use at least 10 characters. It's recommended that you use 12 or more. And the more the better, because with each character, passwords become computationally and exponentially more difficult to crack. And use at least one from each of the following groups: uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols. If you work in a corporate environment, you're familiar with this routine, but also choose something meaningful to you and to no one else. I've been in the IT business for a long time, and maybe it's wrong, but I'm not a fan of randomly generated passwords that make no sense, because they usually force people to write them down and stick them on their monitor. And you should have a soft or hard copy of your passphrase in case you forget it, but always store it in a safe location, like a safe. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin clients. There are two basic kinds of Bitcoin clients. Full nodes, sometimes called thick clients, verify all prior blocks and ensure that all transactions are valid. They store complete copies of every block on the blockchain, and they guarantee trust. But there are only three full node clients right now: Satoshi, BTCD, and Libitcoin. Full node clients download an entire copy of the chain and its transactions. so they have access to everything on the blockchain from the beginning of time. Thin clients, on the other hand, provide what's called Simplified Payment Validation, or SPV. They download only the headers for all the blocks in the blockchain, not the transactions themselves. So they can't verify all transactions, but they can verify the transactions were verified by the network. Each subsequent block acts as confirmation, and new thin blocks, that is headers or Merkle blocks, are requested by the thin client. So unlike the trust established in thick clients, thin clients don't require complete processing of the transaction chain, which has the obvious benefit of being less processor intensive. In this video, I'll discuss importing and exporting with Bitcoin wallets. Bitcoin wallets use a format called the wallet import format and wallet export format, which uses a private elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, or ECDSA key. Now that sounds pretty impressive, but really what you need to know is that it's a secure method for protecting your Bitcoins. You can test how the algorithm works at this site if you're adventurous. Now, when you import or export with your wallet, the software may warn you that proceeding may affect your wallet and Bitcoins. And you shouldn't worry too much about this warning, but make sure that you know what you're doing when you import. Now, when you're on the wallet import export section, you'll see something called watch only address, which is where you can enter any public Bitcoin address, and this allows you to review the status of this address, any address. This is safe because it's read-only. You can also import a private key in this section, which you use for Bitcoin addresses belonging to you. And you can import private keys from addresses you own, directly or by sweeping, which means transferring Bitcoins from your private address into another address owned by you. This allows you to send and receive Bitcoins with the address you enter, and it's safer than importing Bitcoins directly into your wallet. You'll also see an option in the import-export section to import using a paper wallet, and this would require a private key and scanning of the QR codes on your paper wallet. In this section, you can also import a previous backup, but exercise caution because that will overwrite your current Bitcoin ownership. When exporting from your wallet's import-export section, you can choose to export encrypted, which allows you to manually export all your private keys using the Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES, and you can import them back into or another wallet at any time. Choosing export unencrypted means no encryption will be used. The exported keys are plain text, and this is a completely insecure method and not recommended. Choosing export unencrypted means no encryption will be used. The export keys are plain text, and this is a completely insecure method and not recommended. Finally, you can choose to export to a paper wallet, which will generate a piece of paper with your public and private keys and QR codes that can be scanned later. This paper wallet contains your Bitcoins, in other words, there's no backup. And it's good if you want completely secure storage, like putting your Bitcoins in a safe or safe deposit box. In this video, I'll discuss wallet backups. When you want to back up your Bitcoin data, you can copy all the files in your Bitcoin wallet's data directory. The default locations for Linux, OS X, and Windows are listed here. You can back up automatically or manually, and depending on your wallet software, this procedure may vary. But generally speaking, whenever there's a change to your wallet, a new backup is generated, and you'll find these in your data folder as listed above. You can import backups at any time, but exercise caution because importing a prior backup will overwrite your current blockchain wallet. Backups contain the public and private keys. There are plenty of good reasons to back up your Bitcoin information. For example, a software or hardware failure, a lost passphrase, or a lost private key, which ensures ownership of your Bitcoins. A lost passphrase, or a lost private key, which ensures ownership of your Bitcoins. But really, it's just a good idea to keep a copy. Your backup options typically include email, where the data file blockchain.info is emailed to you as an unencrypted JSON file, so make sure that you use a secure email address. You will have to have a validated email address, which will be validated by the wallet software when you initially set it up. You can also download blockchain.info, another option in your wallet software that's similar to email except that you download it rather than email it. And paper, which is a very secure method with a caveat, is also available. You simply click the paper option, print the page, and secure it in a safe place because your Bitcoins will now be on paper. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin transactions and fees. Bitcoin trading usually involves minimal fees, often just pennies, and they vary. There may even be no fee. The sender, purchaser, usually pays the fee, and it's similar to tax in that your transaction cost will equal the purchase price plus the fee. If the fee isn't included in the transaction will be considered incomplete and it won't be processed. Fees are paid to miners, and the fee being part of the transaction for a successfully mined block. While fees are optional, they provide incentive for miners to ensure the mining of transactions and are pretty much commonplace today. Fees can be set by miners or by the Bitcoin core system, which are floating fees, meaning they fluctuate. They're based on processing difficulty and use past performance as a metric to determine the fee based on the current amount of processing power on the Bitcoin network. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin security issues. Bitcoin is considered to be very secure because of the underlying blockchain technology, but there are issues that need to be considered. The Bitcoin blockchain uses SHA-256, which is 256-bit encryption, and it's an extremely secure encryption method that would require a tremendous amount of processing power to crack. So generally speaking, the Bitcoin protocol itself is secure, but it's not as secure as blockchain. Remember, there's a difference. The underlying technology behind Bitcoin is blockchain, but blockchain is not Bitcoin. And with Bitcoin, there's a concern about double spending, which is the act of spending the same Bitcoins on different things. Generally speaking, the Bitcoin network makes it very difficult to double spend, but we now know that it's not impossible. It's up to merchants to do their part to avoid it, and that may be problematic. Additionally, a 51% attack, where one node has 51% or more of the hashing activity, could change everything because that node could control the blockchain and allow things like double spending or arbitrary cancellation of transactions. And wallet software could pose problems because the developers of the software are responsible for adhering to security standards. Likewise, unsecured websites like online exchanges that are responsible for their own security and poorly designed or even fraudulent exchanges have the potential to be insecure, and there are plenty of examples of breaches over the lifetime of Bitcoin as proof. So what can you do to protect yourself? Well, start with a strong passphrase. Opt for multi-factor authentication, back up frequently, and spend some time researching wallets and exchanges. Don't put all your Bitcoin eggs in one basket, meaning don't store them with an exchange or website. Store them offline, either on a hardware wallet or a paper wallet. And if you must store them online, keep them with exchanges, but check the reputation and record of the exchange. And it's advisable to keep some, but not all of your Bitcoins there, just what you need, essentially. Common sense is the best approach. Treat your Bitcoin account the same way you would your bank account, credit cards, and other items of value. And always be aware of what you're clicking, because there are plenty of malicious users out there waiting to pounce. In this video, I'll discuss cold storage of Bitcoins. Typically, Bitcoin exchanges let you withdraw your Bitcoins during a transaction, or at any time for that matter. But exchanges also store Bitcoins, often a lot of them. And to protect against theft or hacking, exchanges use something called cold storage, which is the act of storing Bitcoins offline. In other words, not on a computer. There are several suitable methods for cold storage, and you can do the same. You can use paper wallets, which are printed Bitcoins, removable media like a USB thumb drive, a safe deposit box or safe, and even physical Bitcoins, which are minted coins. You can use hardware wallets, which cost a bit of money, but they're very secure, and sometimes you can store your Bitcoins online without an encryption key. There are various issues with cold storage, so just be aware of them before you choose a method. On paper, obviously, anyone can see or use it, so store it wisely. And remember that paper can get wet, burn, decay. It can be destroyed. Physical coins aren't a bad method, but they can be stolen, and if you have a lot of Bitcoins, it may not be practical to store or transport physical Bitcoins. Bitcoins can be stored on a computer or other device, but systems are subject to corruption or destruction, like in a fire, and they can be hacked. You could also store your Bitcoins on a physical medium, like a DVD or thumb drive, but remember that they're not impervious to time. They can be destroyed and they can be stolen. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin conjoining. Conjoining is a method that's gaining popularity in protecting the anonymity of Bitcoin users. During transactions, two or more parties agree to conjoin, which means combining or conjoining their Bitcoins. How is this possible? Well, the technology allows for it. You pool your Bitcoins into a single address for transactions. What's interesting about this is that modern digital platforms have given organizations the ability to work collaboratively in the digital world, and there's little or no additional cost to conjoining. Conjoining, or coin mixing as it's also called, provides anonymity because multiple parties pool their bitcoins, effectively avoiding a trail of digital breadcrumbs. The address with the pooled bitcoins doesn't have a trail. It's an added method for enforcing anonymity, and Bitcoin already provides a level of anonymity, so it's extremely secure. Addresses don't point fingers. But for people who absolutely must have anonymity, it's still not as anonymous as they would like it, because how addresses are used can still suggest a trail in the sense of how and where the address is used. For example, IP addresses on the blockchain could point to a user or users, but it would still take a lot of work to draw a line to specific people. As I said, conjoining is gaining in popularity, and it's a strategy that was created specifically to hide the identity of users. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin merchants. If you're a merchant or business looking to accept Bitcoins as payment, it's pretty easy to get started. It may be a more attractive option for merchants because there's no intermediary like credit card processors, for example, and payment can be sent directly to a merchant's Bitcoin address. There are two basic methods for receiving payments as a business: manual and automatic. In the manual method, you get a Bitcoin wallet and provide a Bitcoin address to your customers at the time of purchase, because you should never use the same address more than once. When the transaction has been processed and you know you've been paid, you fulfill the order. Refunds work in reverse, so the customer provides an address to you and you refund the payment to that address. This is a pretty great method for receiving payments in Bitcoin, but you might wonder how merchants with thousands of transactions would do it. And that's where the automatic method comes in, because you simply wouldn't have the ability to generate one-off addresses if you had thousands of transactions in the course of a day. In the automatic scenario, you can accept Bitcoins without having to generate one at a time. Addresses are created in batch and stored for later use, for example, in a database on your server. When a purchase occurs, an address is taken from the batch of addresses and provided to the customer, who can now send a payment to that address. There are tools that allow you to generate batches of addresses, for example, the Bitcoin address utility. And just by the way of reinforcement, you should use this method and never use the same address. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin payment processing. Like banks and credit card processors, Bitcoin can be used for point-of-sale transactions, the kind you'd find at a retail store or a restaurant, for example. There are blockchain-based software solutions for invoicing, transaction processing, sales tracking, and conversion of Bitcoins to standard currencies. If you want to go this route, you can put your company on the Bitcoin trade page here to begin letting the world know that you now accept Bitcoins. There are plenty of Bitcoin processing services for your point-of-sale needs, and if this list is any indication, it's clearly a booming new industry. For example, Bitpagos, is a Bitcoin gateway for Latin America. CoinGate accepts Bitcoin payments and provides payments in US dollars, euros, or Bitcoins. And Fraud Labs Pro is a fraud screening service for online merchants that support transactions using Bitcoin as a payment. In this video, I'll discuss secure Bitcoin payments. BIP007 is a Bitcoin payment protocol used for secure payments. It's an add-on to earlier methods that offers several new features, and it defines payment processing between merchants and customers for the creation of invoices, transaction processing, converting Bitcoins to other currencies, and tracking sales. What makes this improvement proposal so useful is that it uses plain language destinations, rather than Bitcoin addresses, which are difficult to read and use. It provides a secure proof of payment that's non-refutable. It provides refund locations, and it provides transaction information, for example, when a payment was received, processed, shipped, or completed. If you're interested, you can find out more about BIP7 at this site, and this is the actual text of the new features added in BIP7. First, human-readable, secure payment destinations that customers can send to a location like a URL instead of the long and unfriendly 34-character Bitcoin address. Secure proof of payment that can be used in the event of disputes. A resistance to man-in-the-middle attacks, which are attacks where a hacker would intercept communication between the parties and use or change that information for malicious purposes. And payment received messages, so the customer knows the ongoing status of their order until it's fulfilled. Finally, refund addresses that can be automatically provided to a merchant. In this video, I'll discuss regulations and Bitcoin. Bitcoin is still very nascent. It hasn't even been around for 10 years, and that normally means that governments haven't fully caught up with it yet. You can be assured that they will, though. And different countries have already implemented different regulations, while others haven't even tackled the issue yet. Some countries have banned Bitcoin, though, or have enforced deep restrictions on the cryptocurrency. And it's safe to say that different governments and different agencies within governments regard Bitcoin in different ways. An Internal Revenue Service, for example, is going to have a vastly different kind of interest in Bitcoin than, say, a Department of Commerce. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples of what's already happened in the regulatory scene over Bitcoin. And this is just the very tip of the iceberg. Again, there's lots more to come, but as you'll see, some things have been happening. In May 2016, for example, Vietnam announced that it was developing a legal framework for digital currencies. In 2013, the United States classified Bitcoin as a convertible, decentralized currency. In 2016, a U.S. judge ruled that Bitcoin was a fund, just like any other definition of a fund. And while it's not officially banned yet, Bitcoin very much appears to be banned in Russia. In Canada, Bitcoin is regulated under laws concerning money laundering and terrorist financing. And in 2015, the EU ruled that Bitcoin is exempt from the value-added tax. In other words, it's not a commodity, and one can infer from that it's regarded as a currency, although that's not explicitly stated in the ruling. Now, before trading in Bitcoin, you may want to check your own country's regulations, as every country is different and there's no global consensus. And you can bet there will be much more to come. It's certainly very interesting to see how countries will deal with this new technology. In this video, I'll discuss Bitcoin and taxation. Bitcoin is a currency, and while it's fairly new, it's only natural to wonder how taxation fits with the cryptocurrency. Bitcoin is sales tax exempt in some places, and if you plan on dealing in Bitcoin, you need to know how it will affect your income tax situation. In the EU in 2015, it was ruled not to be a commodity and therefore not subject to the value-added tax. In the US in 2014, the IRS stated that Bitcoin is a capital asset and subject to capital gains tax that's calculated in US dollars. And unlike the EU, the United States Commodities Future Trading Commission ruled in 2015 that Bitcoin is a commodity and is therefore taxable. The IRS in the US also considers mining profits to be income, so if you're mining in the United States, your income is taxable. On the upside, sort of, if you lose money at mining, you can use your losses as a write-off. Additionally, in Canada, transactions made with Bitcoins are subject to the Canadian tax code for bartering and trade. Therefore, it must be reported as income and/or expenses. It doesn't require a cash transaction, meaning that whether it stays as Bitcoin or is converted to Canadian currency, it's still taxable. Businesses dealing in Bitcoin, for example, merchants accepting Bitcoins as payment, must report it just like any other revenue. And dollar amounts must be assigned using the exchange rate at the time of the transaction, as you would with any other foreign currency when you're doing your taxes in a specific country, in this case, Canada. As for capital gains, they're determined by any profit generated from digital currencies, not just Bitcoin, that you own. Stay tuned for more, no matter where you live. Governments don't always move swiftly, but they will catch up. Now that you've learned more about working with Bitcoin and blockchain, it's time to put some of that knowledge to work. In this exercise, you'll prepare responses to the following questions about Bitcoin mining, wallets, and security. First, what is proof of work and what is its purpose? Second, what are paper wallets? What kind of authentication is recommended for securing wallets? Name at least 2 best practices for choosing a wallet passphrase. What's the main difference between full nodes and thin clients? And finally, what is cold storage? At this point, you can pause this video and perform the exercise. Once you're finished, resume the video and see how I would answer these questions. Okay, so let's answer these questions. I've captured most, but maybe not all of the possible responses, so if you don't see your answers here, that's all right. First, what is proof of work and what is its purpose? Well, the answer is proof of work is the need to make transaction processing computationally difficult, but easy to verify through hashing. Its purpose is to discourage malicious activity like distributed denial of service attacks and spam. Next question, what are paper wallets? Well, the answer is paper wallets are bitcoins that are physically printed. They contain the public and private keys and scannable QR codes. Next, what kind of authentication is recommended for securing wallets? And the answer is multi-factor authentication is recommended because it uses multiple methods, including a passphrase. Okay, next question. What's the main difference between full nodes and thin clients? Well, the main difference is that full nodes download all transactions, while thin clients download only the headers of transactions. Next question. What is cold storage? Well, the answer is cold storage is the act of storing bitcoins that aren't connected to the internet, either on a secure device or in physical form. I hope you found this exercise helpful.